Good afternoon, everyone. I'm John Uglenski, Director of Communications and IT for IEEE-USA. On behalf of the volunteers and staff of IEEE-USA, we'd like to welcome you to EVOPro, the professional evolution of you. IEEE-USA EVO conferences are a place to never stop learning, to expand your horizons, and to challenge you to be a better version of yourself. We're happy you've taken time to join us today. We've got two amazing keynotes that will connect you with trailblazers in their field, focusing on technology trends, career guidance, and future perspectives. We also have an amazing panel coming up, a discussion in partnership with the IEEE Computer Society celebrating their 75th anniversary on the future of technology and its impact on society. IEEE-USA would like to thank Mercer and the IEEE Computer Society for helping us sponsor this event, along with the many other organizations, both internal and external, that have shown their amazing support. Please be sure and share your EVO conference experience today here on social media, wherever you post, using the hashtag EVO Conference. Help us spread the word. We'd love to see some pictures of you watching us live. So now let's get the ball rolling and jump right into our opening keynote featuring Ashley Stahl. Ashley is a career expert, host of the U-Turn podcast, and best-selling author of U-Turn, Get Unstuck, Discover Your Direction, Design Your Dream Career. Please join me in welcoming Ashley to the virtual EVOPro stage.
Hello! I am so excited to be here. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. So I would absolutely love to just say hello before we get started. I want to talk to you about how to figure out who you are in your career and how to turn that into truly a path that makes sense for you and that lights you up. So let me share my screen right here. Share screen. Okay. For a second, you'll see me. Okay. And then I can bring on these slides. So I'm really here to just help you do work that you absolutely love. And part of that for me means discovering your core skill set. And as a career expert, as a best-selling author of a career book, and as the host of the U-Turn podcast, one thing I hear all the time is people come up to me and say, I need clarity, as if it's something that we can, buy at a Starbucks. But the truth about clarity is that usually it's not clarity that you need. It's just the ability to connect with yourself. So I wanted to just share a little bit about me and what we're going to cover today. So I'm a counterterrorism professional turned career expert. I write for Forbes. I'm an author. I have a show, and I'm the spokesperson over at SoFi, and I really am here in this world to help you land job offers, become more confident, make career pivots, even if you don't think they're going to make sense, making sense of your career pivots, and even get clarity on what your vision is for your career or what path is truly a fit for you, and to help you step into leadership. So I want to start off with what your limits are, and I want to give you a moment just to think about this one. So you can say to yourself, write down on a piece of paper, or if you have a PDF in front of you with the workbook that I had sent out, I'm not where I want to be in my career because, and just fill in the blank. What is the first thought you're having? I'm going to just give you a second. Okay. So, you might have said, I'm not where I want to be in my career because I need more experience, because I need to go get that extra training, because I'm not confident enough. Whatever the reason is, chances are it's a limiting belief. And here's the thing, we all come into the world and we kind of have this thermostat that we get set in our minds, and it's set usually by our parents or our primary caretakers. And so it really depends on what kind of environment you grew up in your household. Were you in a house that, your family was talking about success in a way that it felt very possible for you? Were you in a house where money sounded like a very hard topic? What were those conversations like? Usually that sets the thermostat for you of what you think is possible. So I'm not where I want to be in my career because I don't have enough experience. So the first step when you see a limiting belief, because chances are whatever you wrote in the blank is to ask yourself, is it true? Is it true? So from there, you can explore if you have any evidence of the opposite. So look at your belief and ask yourself, do you have any proof that the opposite is the case? Do you have any proof that the opposite is realistically possible? Look at some moments in your life. Where did you show yourself or show up in a way where that wasn't true? And then number 2, forgive yourself. So it sounds like this. You could put your hand over your heart and we could all do this together. I forgive myself for buying into the belief that, and then fill in the blank with your limitation. I forgive myself for buying into the belief that I don't have enough experience. The truth is, and then you want to say something that's new and also true and just more empowering. So you could say something like, the truth is, there's plenty of people out there with even less experience than I have doing what I want to be doing. And the only difference between them and me is my mindset, and I can do it. I forgive myself for buying into the belief that I'm not good enough. The truth is, my body is made of the same elements that anyone else's is. There's the only difference between me and them is how I'm thinking about this, and I can change that. So whenever you feel like your peace is disturbed, I just want to encourage you, or whenever you feel like you're coming up against a limit, I want to encourage you to just take a moment and really ask yourself, what are you telling yourself about where you can be or why you cannot be there? It's so important that you get leverage on your mindset, and this is the way to do it. Okay, so now let's take a look at some career myths. Where is society getting in your way? So here's some myths that I bought into while choosing my college major. The first one was follow your passion. There's this tool called the Google Ngram Viewer. And basically what it does is when you go into Google's Ngram, you can type in a phrase and it shows you how common and ongoing that phrase has been in society. Follow your passion became a trend in the 80s and it really took off in literature and it became a part of our culture. But here's the difference. There's a big difference between being passionate about something and being skilled about something. So I want to share a little bit more about that. Or, follow your bliss, do what you love. My message in my book, U-Turn, is don't do what you love, do what you are. I want to share, what you love matters, but what you are matters more. Another myth is that you should just be networking with family and friends. I have a lot to say about that. Or that you should be applying for jobs online or asking people to pass your resume around, or that you should have a 5-year plan or be climbing the corporate ladder. So let's get into what I feel is really the truth of the matter. The truth is this: don't just follow your passion, because your natural gifts, your natural skills, they matter more. How you use your mind, your body, your heart, your hands throughout the day is so much more indicative. The list of responsibilities that your energy is carrying out is more indicative of your fulfillment than something you're interested in. I'm passionate about, massages and cupcakes, but I would be a horrible masseuse, and I definitely am not meant to be a cupcake baker. So there's a disconnect we have here. Another piece is don't just network with family or friends, because you tell me, when was the last time your dad's friend had the exact job for you that was your dream job? More often than not, it's the case that, someone out there that we don't know is in a position to really hire us. And then another piece is don't apply for jobs online. Here's the thing. The statistics have held pretty strong. More than 80% of jobs don't get posted online. So if you're applying for jobs online right now, you are reaching the jobs that have already been asked around for, that have been internally emailed to employees with a bonus incentive for them to refer someone. It is, in a way, like the bottom of the job hunting barrel. So you want to start being that person that people think of, and that's why cold networking is the way to go. Another thing is asking family and friends to pass around your resume. One of the most important things is not making people feel uncomfortable with your job hunt. And I know that you probably cringe asking people to pass your resume around. And so what I would say is just connect authentically. Let people know that you're in a transition and you're looking to land something, and let them have the opportunity to offer if they want to help. People understand if you tell them you're transitioning and you're looking, that they can offer, or that they, and if you tell them what you're looking for, they will offer if they're comfortable. Another thing is the 5-year plan. I don't know who came up with this 5-year plan, but I don't want to be who I am at 35 at age 40. Who we are is a constant living, growing, changing organism. And it just feels bad for the soul to feel like we're the same person with wanting the same things in 5 years from today. So my wish for you would be to give yourself permission to change. Give yourself permission to figure out who you truly are, what you truly want. Another piece is, don't climb the ladder. So recruiters, they hire you for results. They don't hire you for the amount of time on your resume. So don't get into the mindset that you have to do this step-by-step ladder climb. Yes, there is a dignity to being in a process, but if you are providing extraordinary results, you should be getting extraordinary growth. And if you don't feel like you're providing extraordinary results, ask yourself, who do I need to be? What do I need to provide? Or who do I know at the company who I see as someone giving extraordinary results and doing extraordinary growth? What do I need to do to embody them? Okay, so we kind of touched on some of these core concepts, which is consumer versus producer. I love consuming cupcakes. I love consuming politics. I love consuming fashion content, but I am horrible at baking. I'm way too sensitive to be a politician, and I am not meant to be a fashion designer. I just love fashion, So these are some things that I think are reflecting the disconnect is, what do you like consuming versus what do you want to be producing? It's very different. And there's two core dynamics in your career, which is the what versus the how. The what of your career looks like what your skills are, how you show up with your abilities. The how is more about how your job looks. Given that we know 50% of people leave their job because they don't like their boss, what we know to be true is that how your job looks matters just as much as what your job is. So what does that tell us? That means that the what, your core skill set, needs to be crystal clear. We're going to get into that on this webinar. Also, the how also is about your core values, how your career looks. Meaning, if you value integrity, but you're selling something that you don't believe in, that's not an ideal position to be in. So you really want to make sure that your skill sets that you're using and also the values that you're carrying out are aligned. The third piece of the core concepts is interest versus purpose. Way too often people will say, well, I'm interested in skincare, so I'm going to go work in that whole field. That is a deep dive. It's kind of like dating. You might be interested in somebody, but it doesn't mean that you're going to propose marriage on the first date. So it's the same with career, but for some reason, we're kind of diving all in without knowing enough. So let's see here. Okay, so I have uncovered 10 core skill sets in the workforce, and this came as I was doing my work, just with my book and research. And it's just so important that you know what your core skill set is. After 10 years of working with people one-on-one on my podcast and online courses, I have found consistently that these 10 core skill sets seem to show up in the workforce. And it's so important that you know which one you are. So your core skill set is the natural gift you breathe into all the work you do, regardless of the responsibilities required of you. So for example, I offered to write the newsletter for a preschool while I was working at the front desk. My first job when I was 16 was helping the chef at a preschool. And I was helping him prepare meals for kids, but I would always notice the marketing materials had typos. And for that reason, I would, constantly be going to the front desk saying, hey, I noticed a typo. I need to fix it. My core skill set is words, and it was shining through even when I was helping a chef. Your core skill set is always shining through. So usually it's so obvious to you that you don't even notice that it's a skill set. And you probably have a secondary core skill set, but you really need to know the first core primary one the most. And another piece of the puzzle when it comes to skill set is considering if you're introverted or extroverted. Now, there's a lot of research on being an ambivert, being somewhere between introversion and extroversion. Maybe you're a social person, but you also need your alone time in a big way to recharge. It's important to know which way you lean at the very least. Which one is at least 51% for you? Okay, so let's take a look at the 10 core skill sets. The first one is innovation. This is for the intrapreneurs and the entrepreneurs. It's for the creative self-starters who, are visionary and problem solvers. But the difference between the entrepreneur and the intrapreneur is that the entrepreneur has a relationship with freedom where they need freedom in the ideas that they're working on. They need freedom with the time that they're working on them versus the intrapreneur. It doesn't have to be their idea that they're working on, but they need freedom with executing on it. They need space to execute on the idea that has been given to them. Or it's about their relationship with financial risk. The intrapreneur would rather have a paycheck. The entrepreneur feels more risk not doing what they want to go do out there than having, to risk it and be out there on their own for money. So that's one key. And then we have builders. This is quite literal, and it can also be figurative. So a builder could be a construction worker. It's all about how you're using your energy. Or it can be someone who's building a website. It could be a strategy consultant who is building out a vision for a company or their expansion. It's all about energy levels. So no one core skill set has one key set of job titles. It's really about your core skill set being an umbrella for you. And under it, many different job titles will fit based on how you carry out and harness your core skill set. The third one is words. This one is one that reminds you the importance of knowing whether you're an introvert or an extrovert. The introverted word person is probably going to be a little bit more like me, behind a laptop, writing more often than they're speaking. I love speaking. I travel for speaking all the time, but I definitely take like a 24-hour sleep afterwards because I'm more of an introvert. So most of my success, most of my career is creating content by myself in silence. The extroverted words person is going to be the speaker all the time. They're going to be booking the 200 stages a year. They're going to be the business development person in the workforce, the real estate agent who is using words to make money, who is using their extroversion and their people skills to get energy and succeed and thrive. Skill set number 4, and again, in no particular order, is motion. These are the physical trainers, the athletes. These are the people who are using their energy, their physical energy, and carrying it out in their day-to-day. It could also be a tour guide. Believe it or not, being on your feet is a skill set, and it's something that certain people really have and they really turn to and really enjoy. The next piece is service. Service is a really interesting one because you have to kind of ask yourself, are you a service person because you love to serve, or is this a coping mechanism? Did you learn to be a people pleaser at a young age because that's who you had to be? Really, really key to ask yourself that. So that's the customer service, the social workers, the nurturers, the helpers. You just want to ask yourself, and really with any skill set, is this coming from a wound? Or is this coming from inspiration? I had a client who really tragically lost both of her parents at a young age. And because she was the oldest of 4 siblings, she became their parent. And she told me when she came into one of my online courses that service was her core skill set. And after doing some exploration, we learned that no, service is not her core skill set. It's who she had to be. It came out of the wound of losing her parents and having to care for a household. So it's important to ask yourself, am I really in a skill set as who I am, or is it who I had to be? Coordination also struck for her. So the coordinators are the events operations people, the project managers, the program managers. These are the detail-oriented people. And God bless them. I need them so much. This is not my core skill set. This client that I'm speaking about also resonated with coordination because she was running a lot of things for her household. And again, she realized that's not her core skill set. In the end, she realized it was actually number 10, which is beauty. And she ended up becoming a cosmetic dentist, helping people with their teeth and making it was like a work of art, what she would do with people's teeth. So, it's important to ask yourself which one of these is coming from the truth of who I am versus who I've had to be. And then there's analysis. So this is the researchers, the analysts, the academics, the paralegals, perhaps. So when I worked in counterterrorism in my early 20s, I didn't realize at the time I was a words person. I knew that I liked writing, but I didn't have these categories and I wasn't a career coach yet. So I remember seeing the job description for me to do intelligence analysis, and I thought to myself, oh, awesome. I get to use words. But really looking at it now, creative writing and analysis are using opposite sides of your brain. So it was a misunderstanding of my skill set. I really wasn't meant to belong in analysis. I was meant to belong in words. So it's important to also understand these nuances for yourself. Number 8 is numbers. The number cruncher is pretty straightforward. Accountant, financial modeling, investment bankers. Number 9 is technology, the IT people, they fix glitches, the artificial intelligence creators. And then number 10 is beauty. This could be musicians, artists, interior designers. These are the people who make art of the world around them. So I just want to give you a second with this to ask yourself and just take a look. Which ones do you think you might be? I'm going to give you a moment. Okay. All right. So now that we've talked about the what of what your core skill set is, it's time for us to look at the how, which is your core values. I define your core values as the non-negotiable principles by which you live your life. So you want to ask yourself, what happens when your core values are violated? So for example, let's say you're a words person and you're selling something at a company and you're an extrovert, you're using words to sell, but you're selling something you don't believe in and integrity is a core value. That's a violation of your core values. On the other hand, when it feels like something's missing at work, usually that also has to do with your values. So when you're thinking about your values, you want to ask yourself, what are these top 5 core values I have? Because they are truly a filter for your career choices. And in my book, it's called U-Turn, Get Unstuck, Discover Your Direction, Design Your Dream Career. It's bright yellow everywhere books are sold. There's a huge core values guide for you to choose from. But on this next slide, in case you don't get it, I wanted to provide you with some. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes now to look at these core values, maybe circle your top 10, and then ask yourself if you can narrow it down to 5. And the key thing here is to make sure that you really ask yourself, what word is a representation of who I am at my core? Not what I want to be more of, but who I truly am. So just take a moment and pick words like, for example, when friends come over, if an hour has gone by and I'm not funny at all, they're like, is something wrong with you? And it's because humor is a core value of mine. It's a piece of me. So if people don't hear humor, they think I'm off, because I am, because I'm missing a part of me. So you want the 5 values you choose to be so deeply representative of not who you're trying to become or what you're wanting to get more of, but who you are now, who you embody now in your day-to-day. So take a moment. I'll give you a second. Okay. I'll give you one more moment. Okay. So I want to ask you, what happens for you when you feel like a core value gets violated? Who do you become? Because the truth of the matter is, I believe burnout is what happens when you keep walking down a path that really isn't meant to be yours. That to me is what burnout is. And being in a job every day or having a business every day that violates some part of you, your core values, is one of the most exhausting things you could do to yourself. So, whether you need to have a conversation to make some sort of change at work or you actually need to leave or reconfigure is up to you. But I would say that it is not a good path to go down if you feel like where you are violates these parts of yourself. So, I want to get into some questions, do some spot coaching, support some of you. And I know, John, you see the questions box. I'm all ears. If anybody has anything, let me see if I can get over to the chat box. Okay, perfect. All right.
Fantastic. So thank you, Ashley, for that wonderful presentation. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jonathan Cho from IEEE-USA, and we are now at the Q&A portion of the session. We'll be taking live questions from the audience, so feel free to post them in the live chat or comment section, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. So Ashley, before we get started on the audience questions, we do have some questions that we're dying to ask you
Yeah.
as well. So first, you've helped so many clients across dozens of countries on finding their ideal career paths. What do you think has been the most common or recurring problem your clients faced when trying to find that career path?
Yeah, they're leading with one of the biggest problems that I think get people stuck is leading with the question of what am I interested in versus the question of what am I skilled in. And I think a lot of our skills trace back to our upbringing, our childhood. So, really having a fulfilling career where you express yourself and you contribute in a big way, I think comes down to saying to yourself, who am I? And how have I shown up in my life? Am I a reader? Who am I as a kid? Was I chatty? Was I good with people? Was I social? How am I creating results in my life? How am I moving my life forward that is separate from things I'm interested in? Because your interests are truly a backdrop. Like in the foreground, you're using your skill set. That's how you're spending your 9 to 5 or whatever your hours are. In the background, you might be in a building that is all about sports or fashion because that's something you're interested in. But, I love, I said this in my book, I love 5-star hotels, but if you have me be the chef in there, it's not going to be a fun time for me. So just because you're interested in something doesn't mean you'll take any slice of the pie to be working in that thing. Every industry has many different slices of the pie, and it's more important than anything that you know what slice of the pie you're interested in.
Right, absolutely. Thank you for that insight. So we have our first question from the audience. So the first question, Jonathan asks, how do you respond to a job posting that is much better pay grade but doesn't appear that appealing?
I had a client recently who was really she was a new mother and she was really struggling to go back to her job. And it was really hard to watch because she kept saying to me, there's so much growth potential there. So it feels like I should go back. And I just looked at her and said, "Why would you want to grow something that you don't like?" And I remember she kind of looked at me like, "Yeah." And I'm like, "Do you do that in your life where you see something and say, 'Oh my gosh, hate this. I need to make it more?'" So I would say if you're in that paradigm of this has a better pay grade, but I'm not that into it, I would say you're in scarcity because there's many jobs that are going to pay you more. And I'm pretty sure with, 7 billion people on this planet and millions of job openings that there's another job that is appealing and has a higher pay grade. So I would not compromise on that because once you're done with the chase, once you've negotiated, you're there. And that decision, that way of being is a way of life. Like, people say like, "Oh, I'm just going to choose this." It's like choosing that is choosing it every day. Every day you show up, you're choosing to go somewhere that you're not that happy about. And here's the thing that is really important is people we've been sold this vision of finding our purpose in the workforce. And I believe our purpose is in many places. It's not always in our job, but we spend 90,000 hours of our waking time on this planet at work. That's 2/3 of our time on this planet awake. So I get that people want their work to count, but I would say it's called work for a reason. Everything has a cost of admission. So you have to find that sweet spot between understanding you're using your skills, you're growing who you are, you're growing and harnessing and leveraging an ability that you have so that you can carry that with you in your career. But that you're also not having such high expectations of your career that you're not willing to be the team player, not willing to kind of roll your sleeves up and do those little pieces of the job that you might not enjoy. I would say if you like what you do or you're stimulated or you're challenging yourself and growing 80% of the time, you're in a pretty good spot, especially if you're using your core skill set. And if you want to leave, like the person asking this question, don't go into scarcity because that is a way of thinking and a way of life that you carry with you everywhere. So my question would be, where else are you in scarcity? Are you in scarcity with your health? Are you in scarcity with love? Where else are you in scarcity? And I would fill in the blank with that initial question. I'm not where I want to be in my career because you might have a belief that what you want won't pay you. And so I would look for some evidence of people getting paid doing what you actually want to be doing.
Right, absolutely. I definitely agree with you on that part, where there does need to be a sort of like balance. You need to find like good middle ground where you're leveraging your skill set, at the same time, like you don't want to be doing something that you don't like for the rest for every day for the rest of your life. I feel like I hear a lot of people in my age group these days talking about like wanting to find fulfillment in their careers, but also being paid as well. And I feel like a lot of people I know have tried to kind of like have had that same like struggle finding that middle ground. Do they want more money? Do they want to do what they love? Why not both?
Yeah. 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 I think that you have to take a stand for the and in your life. We tend to think very black and white, especially in our careers. But I just took my little cousin, she's, 7. I took her to the fabric store to get, or the craft store to get some chalk to do chalk on the sidewalk. And I went looking for white chalk, and there was a box of black and white chalk, and it was 50 shades of black and white in that box. And I just thought to myself, this is life. And we are all thinking black or white, but everything is subjective. There's many different colors of black and white. And so if you're in any sort of extreme thinking, usually that comes from fear, that comes from pain. And it's far from the truth. We are not in a black and white world. We are in a gray world. And it's so important that you realize that for yourself.
Right, absolutely. Thank you. So we do see a lot of questions coming in. Thank you to our audience for all these great questions. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can. So this next question, Yvonne asks, "What's the difference between authenticity and genuineness?" Do you have any take on that?
Yeah, I think that for each person, it's a personal resonance. So for example, a lot of the words on the core values guide could sound the same, like growing and learning. For me, learning means accumulating information. And some people like to just know information. And then growing means like applying it and changing as a person. When it comes to authenticity and genuineness, it really just depends on what it means to you. So for me, authenticity is a recurring choice. Um, you know, I I choose to be authentic every single day. I choose to be straightforward. Genuineness, I register as a different feeling, like someone's just so like a sincerity to them. Authentic means being real. And realness can be sincere, but I think genuineness is sincerity. Again, this is my own definition. So what's most important is that you ask yourself what yours is, because I had a client who he told me that adventure was his core value, and I said, well, what does that mean for you? And he said it means, skydiving and mountain biking and a lot of activities he does. And then when I asked my other client in Miami, she said, yeah, well, adventure is a core value for me. I said, what does that mean for you? She said, trying new restaurants in town. And I just remember thinking, all right, your version of adventure would not be so good with this other guy's version of adventure. And this actually happens not just in your career and your life, but in your romantic relationships. You might say, oh, we value the same things. Maybe you value your spirituality, but one person looks at it one way and you look at it a completely different way. So it's important not only to identify the words that hold resonance, but to really take the time to say, how do I show up in these words? How do I know for myself? And have a conversation with people who know you. Research shows that, people have a really good sense of you, often more than you do, because they have no skin in the game other than your happiness. So they're neutral observers.
Mhm. Right. Fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, it's definitely interesting being able to get other people's takes on, different definitions of seemingly the same or similar words. So this next question, one of our viewers asks, what message could you send to people who just got out of college and don't have any experience in jobs?
Yeah, I would say if you want to move your life forward, well, first of all, read my book. I have to shamelessly encourage you because it is written for you. And I mean, all different seasons of people in the workforce. But I think somebody starting out, I just get so many messages from readers saying, I wish I knew this when I started. But I would say the first message is if you want to move your life forward, start having more conversations. That means, you don't have to be on all the time, but like stop looking at your iPhone when you're standing in a line and start getting receptive just to talking to people. Because whenever my career feels flat or unclear, I always say to myself, oh, it's time for me to have more conversations, because there's so much clarity you can get through talking to people. Get on LinkedIn, look for people who inspire you, send them a message letting them know that you're really curious about their career and you're a new graduate. Using the fact that you're a new graduate is very much to your advantage. People have compassion for like the baby birds. So if you can share with them that you're new to the workforce, you're finding your way, and you would love 10 minutes on Zoom with them to hear a little bit more, know that it's a numbers game. And that's one of the headlines in my book is life is a numbers game. So my mantra with job hunting is high intention, low attachment. Send those emails, try to get on those Zoom calls, but understand that it might take you 10 to get one person on Zoom, and that's totally okay.
Fantastic, thank you. And kind of going off the age question, we do have kind of a similar one, though on the opposite spectrum. One of our viewers asks, how do you deal with the challenges related to ageism, making a change later in one's career where experience may be a negative? Because I think this is definitely something that's uh, really related to a lot of our IEEE membership. A lot of our membership are older in years and are very uh, older engineers and such, and we've heard from a lot of our membership about this kind of recurring problem and ageism in the workplace.
Got it. Yeah, I would say, first of all, I'm pretty sure most state laws, like they can't ask you how old you are. Obviously, they can get a sense of it based on your resume. You don't have to put your graduation date. You just have to put graduated with your degree. Usually, it's your education that will date you, for lack of a better term. Another thing is you want to remember that your resume is a document that highlights your relevant experience. Relevant experience. So what that means is if you're making a career pivot, your resume is a game of real estate. You want to look at it and say, how much real estate do I want to give to my time as an admin assistant if I'm trying to become a communications person. Maybe 80% of your job as an admin assistant was doing admin work, but 20% was writing. You're going to want to take that 20% and make it 50 to 60% of the bullet points under that job. You really want to be clear and concise with what experiences you've had that are relevant to the next one. Now, that also means that the first or second job on your resume after you graduated college, you can remove if it's not relevant. That way, you don't have your date of your graduation and you've removed the first couple of jobs. So that's creating some sort of confidentiality also, and not necessarily confusion, but just not clarity about your age. If that's something that you truly feel you're coming up against, I know that I wish that I could sit here and say ageism doesn't exist, but as an expert in the career space, I think my job is just to empower you with tools to work within a skewed system and thrive to the best that you can. And so I would say that's how to play the game there. And I would say the more concise and succinct your resume is, the less your age really matters. People are still looking for people who have the relevant experience to help. And I think being negotiable on your salary always helps. People have an assumption that if you're older, you might expect more money than the position requires. So if they ask you about money, I would say you're negotiable depending on the range they're offering. You're looking for the right fit. I think that's a start.
Fantastic. Thank you. So I do have a kind of going off on that again. I do have a kind of related question. So how do you deal with the age issue, be it old or young, when you finally get a face-to-face or virtual interview? Do you sell your question, or do you sell your experience, or if you're younger, do you play up your enthusiasm?
I would say well, first of all, this reminds me kind of an anecdote, a Picasso anecdote. I was reading about how, Picasso's sitting in a restaurant, he scribbles on a napkin and somebody sees him and says, wow, it's Picasso. I want to see if I can buy that napkin. Runs over and he says, can I buy that napkin from you? And Picasso says, yeah, it's going to be $100,000. And he says, what? That napkin took you 5 minutes. And Picasso says, no, this napkin took me my whole life. And so I would say if you are young, what your job is in your interviews is to look at the qualities that you have as a person, where you really shine that you've been building and working on your whole life. And I would come up with evidence in your life experiences that you have these qualities that are super necessary for the job at hand.
Fantastic. Thank you. So this next question by Carrie, Ashley, are you familiar with any assessments which help participants discover their denominated skill set and core value?
Yeah. Okay. So I don't know any core values assessments. I have a free quiz on my website at ashleystahl.com/free quiz, or I think you could just see it on the homepage right there at ashleystahl.com. But I love the Enneagram. It's the oldest personality test there is. And I find it very interesting to show where you're great and what your shadow is, what your fears are. I also love Myers-Briggs. And when I look at the Myers-Briggs results, which you can just Google the 16 personalities test to get it, I would say, obviously the E or the I, introvert or extrovert, matters a lot, the N or, the T, the S, but I look at whether you're a P or a J, because those are the people that if you're a J on Myers-Briggs, that tells me the person is more structured. They need structure. They're good at showing up on time. They're good with calendars, plans. The people who are a P are a little more spontaneous. And what that looks like is they want to change the flow. They create based on their mood, or they need to delay something because they're not feeling it. They're highly creative, amazing workers. But it's just important to understand where you stand on that so that you can tell your manager how to work with you best.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So this next question, one of our viewers asks, results versus presentation of work. Which is more important? How do you enhance presenting your impact to a business or a company?
Yeah. Well, I would say results are more important than presentation. I think perfection paralysis, one thing I say in my TED talk that I recently gave, is just a mask that we wear for fear of failure. So if you are like fine-tuning presentation and how something looks so much, usually under that is fear of rejection, fear of failure. So I would just encourage you to do your best to really honor that, you are not perfect. What professional may look like doesn't have to be perfect. Focus on results, because a top performer isn't getting stuck in the weeds. They're too busy looking at the results and continuing and being in motion. I think top performers have momentum, and you want to keep that momentum alive.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So, folks, we have time for a couple more questions. I know a lot of you have posted it. And they have been great questions. Thank you so much. So, Ashley, this next question, and might be relevant to a lot of people trying to decide on a career change. Any suggestions on how to overcome procrastination and taking that first step to pursuing authenticity? Excuse me, looking for a new job when you're comfortable but not satisfied with your present job.
Any suggestions on how to overcome procrastination? Well, I think that there's a couple things at play. When you're resisting something, either it's fear or you don't actually want to do it. So, people who don't feel like they have a lot of purpose, suddenly they have so much purpose when they're feeling really excited about something, and all of a sudden they get all this energy for it. So if you're low on energy, you're just low on purpose. Usually you don't feel like you actually want the thing you're saying that you want. So I would ask yourself, do you really want that new thing? Like, does it really excite you? And then I would also figure out, what's keeping you. So I would fill in the blank. I am not taking action right now because I think that, or because I don't want to, like, fill in the blank. What is the belief that is holding you hostage right now and keeping you from taking action? So sometimes this kind of procrastination just means you need to take it off of your list. You don't really want the new thing that much anyway. You need to give yourself permission. Another piece of it is your relationship with yourself. So a lot of people in the self-help personal development world, they want to take action before they are in a lot of pain. But the way the human experience tends to work is there's two dynamics. There's fear of the unknown over here, and then there's your misery in your current state. It's usually not until your misery in your current state outweighs the fear of the unknown that you're willing to make a change. My relationship with myself is, as soon as, I'm not afraid of the unknown as much as your average Joe, because I do a lot of work on my mind. That's what I've devoted my life to. Or should I say average Joe or Josette, but I would say that I notice when I feel lukewarm, and that's enough for me. So I would ask you, where did you learn to suffer? Where in your life, where in your upbringing did you learn that it's fine for you to just sit there and suffer, and that everything has to be hard and be painful, and that you don't have to show up for yourself? That's where the real work is.
Fantastic. Thank you. So this next question, and we have time for a couple more questions, folks, so we'll try to get to them as soon as we can. Do you think that one can pursue a position that seems very attractive, but for which he considers that he doesn't have enough skills?
Do you think that one could pursue a position that seems very... Of course. Yeah, I think that personality trumps experience. So that's why networking is so important. And one of the things in my Job Offer Academy course I talk about a lot is like how to network with the right people who can actually hire you. And so I would say pursue that position, but it's in my opinion a waste of time unless you follow up with the person who's in charge of hiring, which you can figure out who they are based on the advanced search on LinkedIn. And if you need support with that, head on over to jobofferacademy.com, check out the course that teaches that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Well, Ashley, I know we could ask you questions all day, but unfortunately we are out of time. Thank you so much for an engaging session and for your insightful answers for our audience. We really appreciate you joining us today for our EVOPro event.
Thank you so much for having me. It's nice to meet everyone, and thanks for the great questions.
Absolutely. And for our EVO conference registrants, we will be providing one of Ashley's PDF workbooks for free after completing the conference evaluation form, which you will receive in an email right after this event. Up next is our second EVOPro keynote session presented by Joe Grand of Grand Ideas Studios. Stay tuned, and we'll be back after this short break.
Hi everyone, my name is Graham Fuller and I'm part of the Mercer Affinity leadership team. For those of you who don't know, Mercer Affinity is the insurance program administrator for the IEEE Member Group Insurance Program. For over 60 years, IEEE and Mercer Affinity have been proud partners in serving the insurance needs of IEEE members and their families. The IEEE Member Group Insurance Program provides insurance solutions such as life insurance, professional liability insurance, health insurance, disability insurance, and much more. We're also excited to be able to provide additional solutions such as telemedicine, counseling, and vision discount services through our partners at New Benefits. And coming soon, we're excited to announce the introduction of Tech Protect, a solution to protect smartphones, tablets, computers, gaming consoles, TVs, and monitors from accidental damage, all for less than $20 a month. I'd like to invite you to explore all the solutions available to you through your IEEE membership by visiting IEEEinsurance.com. Here's wishing you a productive and meaningful EVO21 conference. Thank you.
I had the coolest job that any electrical engineer could ever have on the ground crew for Solar Impulse 2, the first solar-powered airplane to fly around the world only using the power of the sun. IEEE-USA has given me a competitive edge because of their support system. It is so much easier doing something and being out of your comfort zone when you have someone there saying, "You got this." IEEE-USA is more than just a network. It's a family.
Thanks for being with us this afternoon at EVOPro. A big thank you to the folks at Mercer and the IEEE Computer Society for helping IEEE-USA bring EVO to you. If you're enjoying this event, be sure to discover everything that IEEE membership has to offer by visiting IEEEUSA.org/discover. The professional evolution of you continues now with our next keynote speaker. We're very excited to have Joe Grand joining us here on the virtual stage. Joe is also known as Kingpin. He's a computer engineer, hardware hacker, product designer, teacher, honorary doctor, TV host, member of the legendary hacker group Loft Heavy Industries, proprietor of Grand Idea Studio, and partner in offspec.io, a cryptocurrency wallet recovery service, something that has been desperately needed from what I understand from some folks who have lost big bucks by not being able to get into their wallet anymore. He's been creating, exploring, and manipulating electronic systems since the 1980s, one of my favorite decades. Please welcome to the EVO live stream, Joe Grand. Good to have you here, Joe.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the introduction. Thanks everybody for watching at home. I normally walk around a stage and I like to move, but here I'm stuck in the chair. So hopefully you still get some energy out of this. So this talk is a little bit interesting. Normally I give technical talks, and this one is a little bit technical, but it really is something kind of targeted towards engineers to kind of make you paranoid about what hackers can do to hardware and what adversaries might do to hardware. So if we're talking about kind of, career changes or advancements, this is something where if you are a product designer and you want to get your mind into that of an attacker, that's going to give you skills that are going to let you design a product better. Or you might be thinking, hey, I'm kind of tired of designing products. I want to start breaking them. There's an actual whole career path now of reverse engineering hardware, figuring out how it works, finding vulnerabilities, all of this stuff. So, this is not as deep as a topic of what you just saw, but it's my passion. It's something I've been involved in since I was a kid. I am formally an actual product designer. I've been reading IEEE journals and gone to events and stuff since I also was a kid, much younger than they normally allow into those places. And engineering is my passion and hacking is my passion. I've kind of straddled the fence for most of my career of breaking products and designing products. So this presentation is kind of really an overview of that, kind of an overarching view of how an attacker approaches a piece of hardware, and then maybe some things, again, that you can take out of it to make your products more secure. So let's go. So we're going to have a little bit of overview about hardware hacking. If you're not familiar with it, if you're coming more from an engineering side, we've all read about hackers and security and stuff. Now it's in the mainstream, media all the time. And what's really interesting is a lot of the attacks that we're seeing from a hardware perspective tend to be the same classes of attack. So something new might come out on a new product, but really a lot of the process and approach is the same. And we'll get into that. So really, if you have this ground level understanding, you'll be able to really apply that to just about anything. And of course, there will be new techniques and new things as technology advances, but it's all built on this same kind of process. So we'll talk about a few attack vectors, some of my favorites. I call a few of these low-hanging fruit, so things that are really easy from an engineering perspective to try to maybe mitigate. But as you'll see, and as we go through this, it's really hard to make secure products. And it's something that you really need to take care from the beginning to implement. And there's all sorts of reasons why, it may or may not work at the end. But it's a challenge for sure. So I definitely enjoy being on the hacking side more than the design side, because somebody's always going to find a vulnerability or some problem with your product. And it's happened to me as well. Friends of mine have found problems in products that I've made that weren't even intentionally meant to be secure, but it's still like, oh, I can't believe I did that. Or I can't believe they actually found that, potential bounds checking issue that I forgot to, put in the code. So somebody's always going to find an issue. It's just, a matter of how you respond to it and how you can make products better moving forward. I do have a section on best practices. I'm not going to go through all of those, but I wanted them in here just as reference for you to, if you needed a starting point of like, all right, let's focus on this section and get a little better. That's what that's there for. So a little bit of overview, hardware hacking isn't just about breaking security of a product just because you can, a lot of the, or maybe because it's some state-sponsored actor that's doing it as, some malicious intent. There's lots of other reasons as well. And a lot of this really comes down to you as an engineer understanding what your product is doing and maybe why somebody would want to hack your product. So I'm not going to go through all of these. Again, it's mostly for reference, but there are lots of reasons why somebody's going to look at a device, and how they attack your device might vary depending on what the goals are. Here's the hardware hacking process. This is something, as an engineer, I'm very formal in my process, whereas hackers, you always hear, oh, they think outside the box and do this and do that, which is true. But this is kind of like when I attack a product, this is what I do every single time. It is this kind of rigid process, but then I'll vary things and I'll get a little more fluid as I'm within these subsections. But I usually, get a lot of information about the product. I'll take it apart. I'll look at the components. I'll see how things are connected. I'll see if there are any very obvious test points or exposed interfaces and buses and signals that I can monitor to extract information or maybe inject information. I will try to extract firmware, program contents, memory, data, configuration, whatever I can from memory, and then maybe deal with some chip level actual silicon die analysis as well, or modification. Not all of this stuff is required for every time you do an attack, but it is this general process. And we'll talk about a few of these stages. As far as approaching hacking hardware, a lot of times we'll hear about, a hacker got access to a system over a network and then they did something. Or somebody got physical access to a laptop and did some attack. That's possible as well. But there are variations. So, attacking the hardware directly. So you have a piece of hardware that has some security vulnerability. You exploit that to win, whatever it is. Maybe you're trying to defeat security to extract firmware or bypass an authentication check or something like that. Or maybe you're attacking with the hardware. So using the hardware as a stepping stone to get access somewhere else into the network. So we think about this with like the botnets on IoT connected cameras. Or maybe I had read a story, I don't know if this one's true, but it's somebody had gotten access to some internet connected fish tank that was connected to a casino network, so they could use the fish tank as the launching point for the rest of their attack. And a lot of times hardware is actually used as a mechanism to get access to software or to firmware, and then using hardware as that other entry point to then be able to modify the hardware, or modify the firmware or the software to do something different. And then we also have hardware implants. So this is taking an already functioning, designed, operable system, and somewhere along the supply chain, implanting some additional thing to it. And I know the US government has done this. I'm sure other governments have done this. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well, as far as kind of the threats from an engineering perspective of things you want to think about as you're manufacturing your product. I love this slide. It's from 1970, from a report about computer security. So, you know, yes, we're talking about computer security now in 2021, whatever year it is, 2021. 50 years later, a lot of these topics have been discussed for generations before us. It just happens that hardware security is becoming more of a mainstream, more of an understood thing. But, you know, if you've been around the industry for a long time, much longer than I have, you will see a lot of similarities. So this talks about a lot of common attacks that are exactly the same to what we're seeing now. The technology is a little more integrated. You know, instead of having a giant mainframe computer and communication lines between different buildings, it's kind of the same thing, except we replace processor and switching center with 2 chips, communication line as the signals between them. And now we're just getting more integrated. But all of these risks and threats from 1970 are still common. And that's what's so mind-blowing. And you want to keep that in mind as you're developing your product. It's like, there are really no secrets. You know, somebody will always find some new method. But again, like, this is 50-year-old knowledge, but fixing it is really hard and expensive. And a lot of times, you know, as engineers, we have these constraints of needing to design the system on time and make sure it works and make sure it's under budget and make sure it can be manufactured and tested and repaired and all of this stuff, where attackers don't really have to do that. They don't care about the constraints. They're going to find the one weak spot or the one mistake you made and try to exploit that. So it's really a, you know, really a battle, a literal arms race, a cat and mouse game between attackers and designers. So if you are on the engineering side and you want to think about what security you might want to implement in your system, it really varies because nothing's 100% secure. You can't protect against every possible attack. It doesn't happen. Even if you're secure at this point in time, somebody might find something later and now you're all of a sudden vulnerable. Even if you're trusting security features inside of chips, as you'll see in one of the demos I'll give you, sometimes you can't even trust what the vendor's doing because they have problems that they don't even know about. But really, if you can try to think about what your risk is, what would an attacker be going after, then you can start fashioning your design a little bit better. But really, it comes down to security versus convenience, and reality of that is like, how much money do you want to put into it? What's the value of the data or the value of the attack that somebody would want? Is it worth spending X amount of money or X amount of months to break your product? Sometimes it might be, sometimes it might not. Okay, so let's get into a few of kind of selected hardware hacking processes. We have exposed interfaces coming up first. And this is really just something as an engineer, you know, we want to think about these things because they're kind of a natural part of designing boards and designing systems. But from an attack perspective, one of the first things I look for is exposed interfaces. Chips communicating, so what I call internal interfaces, chip-to-chip communication, as far as like, is there data between a microcontroller and external memory or some external peripheral over I2C or SPI or one of these, you know, common buses that we can monitor, or even something to the outside world, whether that's going to be a serial port interface for administration, maybe it's a debugging interface, or maybe it's, say, even a keypad or a smart card interface or something else intended for the user that we can actually still exploit. Once we find those, we can try to figure out what the interfaces are. Can we manipulate those signals? Can we take advantage of programming and debugging capabilities that were there intentionally, that engineers put there intentionally for engineers and for manufacturers to program the board and debug the board and test it and all of that? Can we use those and exploit those? There's a lot going on in that space. And really what makes it hard from an engineering perspective is, we can't expect every engineer to be trained in security unless we start training at a very, very early part in the process. So you think about security all the time, but a lot of the chips that we have to use in our systems don't have security built in. They transmit information in the clear with no authentication, meaning if we can tap onto those lines and listen to some of these exposed interfaces, we can now get data that's intended for 2 chips and then start working with that. So it really is like, playing a game of operator, or it's like you're, 2 kids with the string and the cans and someone else is spying on that. That's kind of what it is. And until the chips themselves have support for more secure communication, maybe encryption and things like that, it's going to be maybe easier. And then the attack will change, but it's just that I don't see that happening, anytime soon. So it's really a tricky thing from an engineering perspective. We really need to be aware of what these interfaces are being used for, and maybe we can encrypt or obfuscate some of the data on our own. But again, that is a design decision that we have to figure out. So these are just some examples of some boards that I had lying around. A lot of times we'll open a board and we're going to see a set of test points or an unpopulated connector on the board. Sometimes there's silkscreen markings like the upper left. It's like, oh, VCC, TX, RX, and ground. We know that's our asynchronous serial communications port, right? Our UART. Very easy for us to attach up to that. Those tend to be boot log, diagnostic information, administrator access, maintenance consoles, things intended for humans because we can connect up and type with our computer to interact with that. On the upper right is a very common JTAG implementation. So JTAG being the Joint Test Access Group. It's IEEE 1149.1, which kind of specifies this low-level debugging protocol. Actually, a low-level state machine and kind of debugging and programming have been built in over time. But essentially, to me, JTAG is like the Achilles heel of hardware. If you can find that, you not only get, like you would with a vendor-specific debug interface, programming support, being able to single-step, view memory, stuff like that. Through JTAG, you can actually control the actual pins of hardware and twiddle those as you want to communicate to external devices on that thing. So it really makes it a lot easier to work with. But in this case, we can look and say, okay, it's unpopulated 2x7 row header, very obvious. And then we see like a set of resistors right next to it. Those resistors are RA20 is pull up or pull down resistors to set the idle state of that JTAG bus when it's not in use. So we can even use something as simple as a resistor array on a board to give us a clue about what signals we're looking at. And it's good engineering practice to put them near the signals that they're associated with, right? So if we were trying to obfuscate this, we would kind of be defeating or going against what we're kind of taught as far as engineers go. Lower left, another good example. This is another JTAG interface. This was on an old BlackBerry device, but we see there's lots of little test points all over the board used for normal types of testing, during manufacturing. But then there's these 7 bigger test points in one area right there. As an attacker, I look at that and say, okay, those are definitely something obvious. I want to go after those because they're bigger and they're more organized in one space. So that makes it easier, of course, from a manufacturing perspective and a test perspective, because they're near the edge of the board. We can attach onto them very easily, but that means the attacker can do the same thing. And the lower right is another type of interface. This is actually an ARM serial wire debug, a 2-pin version kind of subset of JTAG. And something like this, if it's a simple board like this, we can actually look up the part number, figure out what debug capabilities that part has, and just visually trace out where things go. So a lot of these are really not complicated, but it's something that one of the first steps always that attackers are going to look at is like, how easy is it to connect up to a board? Sometimes we'll see the connectors, unpopulated connectors or test points covered over in solder mask, right? So during development, during FCC testing, all of the pre-production, those signals are exposed, so we as engineers can use them. But then once we get our FCC testing and everything's ready to go, we can't make material changes to the board to say remove those. That could affect some emissions or some other stuff. So let's just cover them over with solder mask, and an attacker will never connect to them. Where in reality, all it takes is like, a little knife, scrape that off, make connections, and then we can go to town. That one in the upper left, you got to look in a little close, but you can actually see there are some resistors associated with some of those pads. So you can take a guess right away, and you can also see the traces going up to the one on the right side. You can take a guess and say, okay, that's probably going to be JTAG or some other, some other open drain or some other interface that requires pull up and pull down resistors as its idle state. Upper right is an iPhone board. I don't remember what version of the iPhone, but same thing where there's an unpopulated connector covered in solder mask underneath the SIM card slot or the SIM card connector. So obviously intended during development, but an attacker in theory could take off the SIM card, get access to that connector, and then use all of those same mechanisms. And yes, you're probably thinking, well, we can just prevent that. We can lock down JTAG after we're done during manufacturing, enable code protection so people can't use this stuff. Yes, and that's a great thing to do. When we get to fault injection, I'll show you why that's not always a guaranteed, method of security. We see some other obfuscation as well that people do. As far as engineers know, we need to have our UART interface or our JTAG interface. So they'll make little component footprints and populate those during development, and then do not populate during production. So we can see that lower left, there's actually resistors missing that make the connections for those from that exposed connector to the microcontroller. So you just put a solder blob on there and you're good to go. You've re-enabled that interface. Sometimes vendors will also try to swap the pins of a common interface. The lower right is a microchip PIC ICD, the in-circuit debugger, with its ICSP interface, which is the 1x6 row header that they recommend. And one vendor just switched 2 of the pins. So if an attacker went and plugged in regular development hardware to the board, it wouldn't work. Once you reverse engineer that, you flip those 2 pins, and now you've re-enabled the interface. So obfuscation, it doesn't really work. It maybe slows down an attacker. Once you're able to know what the interfaces are, it's like, all right, let's see what we can do with it. Can we capture information? Can we decode it? Can we maybe replay that information later? So there's lots of different attacks about this. I'll show you one video, one of my favorites, but there are a lot of resources of capturing inter-chip communication and then replaying that. Spoofing information, as far as modifying data that you've copied and decoded and then creating some other data packet that's going to get what you want. Man in the middle or person in the middle, where you're actively changing communication between 2 chips. So if you say there's some authentication between 2 chips or there's some communication happening, if you insert yourself as some additional piece of hardware or some other custom thing that you've made to take data coming from one way, modify it, send it on its way, the endpoints don't know that they're not talking to each other. So we've seen this a lot, actually more recently with TPM, Trusted Platform Modules on PCs, where you can actually take the information coming from the TPM, modify it, send it to the PC, take information from the PC, modify it, send it to the TPM. You can actually extract information and trick the system into thinking that you're authenticated and secure when you're not. And that's what's really interesting to me is, like, if you think about that as you're designing systems, chips are very trusting. They just, okay, I receive signals. They don't question where they're from. They just treat them as signals, right? So it could be a legitimate chip. It could be a hacker. The chip is going to behave either way, whatever you're asking it to do. And that's I would say that's the key thing of that slide. So here's a video of some signal manipulation. This one is actually kind of a combination of a replay attack with some modified data. So this was from the San Francisco smart parking meter that I hacked in 2009, which has since been updated recently, and which took a little while. So what's 2021? This basically, I'd monitored communication of a live smart card to the parking meter to figure out the communication, and then I was able to figure out how the card value was processed by the meter, and modified some of those bytes with my own smart card emulator to spoof that information and then trick the parking meter. So here you actually see there's a smart card there. This was the final version. That's actually a microchip PIC on a smart card. Where my first version, had wires coming out of the meter and everything like that. It just happened that satellite TV hackers who had been using smart cards had one with a blank PIC on it, so I could program my own code onto this thing and stick it in a meter. So here's a great example of signal manipulation and how trusting systems can be. So it shows that the card has $999.99. What I didn't mention is the maximum card that you could actually go buy from a store to use in the parking meter is $50. So there's no bounds checking, and the meter is very trusting. So now I could get free parking for, however long I wanted. I did end up meeting with the city about this. That's something that, a lot of times security researchers do nowadays, is if they find a vulnerability, they go to the customer or the vendor and let them know about the problem, and sometimes even offer to help fix the issue. But more importantly, kind of helping along or forcing the vendors to acknowledge the issue so they can fix it, so their customers end up being secure. And in this case, the city was very responsive and eventually fixed the problem and didn't sue me. So it was great. So another thing that we look into is extracting firmware and manipulating firmware. Computers or embedded systems really are just general purpose computers running some specialized code. So if we think about it that way, a microcontroller is just a very low powered computer, but it's running some code. If we can get access to that code, that's going to tell us every single thing that's happening in that program, in that product. So a very common thing that we go after is looking to extract the firmware from the microcontroller, or maybe it's an external piece of memory that's being read on power up by a microprocessor, say, that doesn't have internal memory. And depending on the system, there's lots of different ways to get program code out. So using a standard debug interface like we talked about, like JTAG, using a device programmer. You'll actually see that a lot of hardware hacking too uses just general engineering tools, right? So like a device programmer, if you've ever programmed memory, every engineer has one. Every hacker has one now also. So we can use that in the same way. Though I will show you some tools developed more from a security hacker research perspective that simplify some more complicated attacks, which are pretty awesome. We can passively capture during boot. If it is an external memory, we can capture that communication as the system's powering up. We maybe need to install some custom program. So maybe we have either firmware update capability, or there's some other way to load some other piece of code, maybe it's through buffer overflow or other things, onto the hardware. And then we have that little piece of code read the internal memory, maybe that's protected otherwise, and then send out the data through a port pin or an LED or a serial port, whatever we can get access to with that little piece of code. Firmware update packages too. A lot of products now will update their firmware on systems, which is great. But if that is done incorrectly, then an adversary could also update firmware through that same mechanism, say by defeating the code signing or whatever other processes are there. But it also means that sometimes you can access firmware without even having physical access to the product, because you can go to the vendor's website and maybe grab that package. Or if you do have physical access to the product and you don't know how the firmware access is happening to do the update, you can monitor the communication from the device to the network, or maybe proxy the communication, find out where it's grabbing that binary blob from for the firmware update, and then grab it that way, and then start doing your analysis. So just, yeah, so many different ways. And then, like I say here, then it becomes a software problem. We've used the hardware as a way to get to that firmware or software. And then we start doing our static analysis, our dynamic analysis, whether we want to figure out what the code is doing, or maybe we're trying to find some credentials or encryption keys or something else that we need. We would go after it in software. And this is really common a lot of times, where engineers will say, well, we're using encryption and we're just hiding our encryption key, in memory. And we have code protection enabled, so nobody's going to be able to get to the memory, which is a good step. But if an attacker knows, okay, we want to get to that firmware because we think the key is there, then they're going to find a way to get access to that firmware, and now they're going to have your key. There might be other things too. Maybe we're doing some code modification. So we're taking the firmware, modifying functionality in a way. Maybe it's to achieve some security goal, but maybe it's to make your product behave in a way that kind of ruins its confidence in the world or in the user base. So making small tweaks. This would be more of like that implant or espionage types of stuff, where it could be small tweaks that affect the way the system operates, just to make people say, oh, that product is horrible, it has too many bugs, or it's failing, or whatever it is. So here's some pictures of that. Device programmer, upper left. For eMMC devices, for embedded multimedia card. So basically, it's kind of SD card on an integrated circuit nowadays, which are really common for like Linux-based operating system devices or other operating system-based embedded systems. You can use an eMMC device that kind of looks like a block file system to the microcontroller or microprocessor. And you can take that device, or an attacker can take that device, stick it into a programmer like we see in the upper right, that's like a BGA socket, or maybe just run wires directly from the BGA part, or do it in circuit by soldering wires if they can get access to, say, the series resistors in line with the eMMC, and not only read the contents out, but actually mount the device on an operating system and then start browsing through the file system, because it appears like a block disk. So it abstracts some of the low-level memory functionality from the engineer, which is great, makes it easy to work with, but then it makes it easy for the attacker to get access to also. The bottom picture here is from an ECU, an electronic control unit from an automobile. And this was some friends of mine hacking a car, and they needed some help getting the code off of the device. You can actually see in the right-hand lower right corner is a pretty large chip, and that's a Freescale automotive microcontroller. And you can actually see there's a little paint mark on there too in the upper left corner of the chip, and that indicates that the device has been programmed. So that's something else that we look for when we're looking on boards. You know, is there any marking on there, anything that indicates that this is a memory device or some sort of programmable device that we can go after? So this one had a debug interface connector right there, so I could just plug in with my P&E BDM interface, the vendor-specific background debug mode interface for this Freescale part. Just plug in and extract all the contents. There was another version of that device that was a smaller ECU that had a similar microprocessor, and also did not have code protection enabled, but it had some other feature that was resetting every once in a while. So I think it was some sort of watchdog or something else. And so I couldn't extract the contents of memory all at one time because the system kept resetting. So I was able to extract a little bit at a time, and then I just concatenated those all together at the end and had the whole thing. So you know, you never really know what you're going to encounter, but these are some of the standard ways of people getting access to your code. This is a fun one. So this is actually extracting firmware during the boot process. So the picture on the upper left, this is a, I can't remember. I'm not going to say what product it is because I can't remember. I don't want to, you know, give the wrong information, but it is some sort of home access point router type of device. And these are very common, really based on like I would say kind of a very kind of similar reference design across lots of products. But this has this Atheros SoC, system on a chip, microprocessor that does not have internal firmware, internal flash. So on the left, we have our RAM, and on the lower right, that's circled in the right-hand picture, that's a serial flash device, so an 8-pin serial flash device. And on power up, the system on a chip is going to read the firmware out of that external device and then execute it from RAM inside of itself. So in our case, we see, oh, there's a blue dot on that one, so we know that's programmable if we didn't already identify the part, because those are pretty easy to find. We can actually tap on to that part, either solder wires, you could clip on with an SOIC clip, a chip clip like I'm doing, and actually use a logic analyzer or use an oscilloscope to capture that communication. I think in this case, it's SPI or SPI, which is it's like a minimum 3-pin serial interface, synchronous serial interface. So we can monitor that communication and then export that, say, from the logic analyzer tool, and now we actually have the code that was sucked off of the device during boot up, which is pretty cool. And some devices do have encryption, so the file system itself on the memory is encrypted, and then it gets decrypted somewhere inside of the chip. So that's good if you can do that. And then my perspective would be like, all right, if we know it's encrypted, let's go and see if we can access where the key is, or maybe let the system decrypt the data as it normally would during boot, and then try to access the decrypted version. Okay, so one other topic is fault injection. You know, we talked about some pretty simple things. Fault injection is more of an advanced technique, but it's becoming easier, and there's so much information out there from an academic perspective, from a real-world attack perspective, and it really all comes down to causing devices to misbehave in some way for an attacker to do what they want to do with it. So, you know, if you're an engineer and you're looking at a data sheet, it's going to show us all of the defined parameters of how we are supposed to control our chip, right? Within this voltage range, within these clock speeds. From an attack perspective, we look at those chips and say, okay, let's find those defined parameters and then operate outside of those. And by doing this in a very precise way, by finding where to potentially cause a fault, to defeat a security mechanism that we want, or to skip an instruction that we want, or cause some other misbehavior, then we can do that fairly repeatedly. So generally, it's like we want to skip an instruction if it's doing some password compare, or like, is Joe the correct user, yes or no? If we glitch at that right point, maybe we can have it say yes no matter what. Maybe we change the branching. Maybe we get some instruction decoding errors, so we're having some other instruction being called instead of the one that's supposed to be called. We get some data back that's incorrect. It really, a lot of times you don't really have control of what the effect is of the fault injection. Just know that you can inject faults into systems, and unless a chip specifically has mitigations against that, which many of them don't, we're starting to see them become, at least some chips start to implement some mitigations, which does definitely make things harder. Of course, it doesn't always make it totally secure, but there are lots of things you can do. So this area really is really interesting, and it feels like magic. Like this, literally, when you actually break a system by injecting a fault into it, is mind-blowing, no matter how many times you do it. So this is one example. This is a device called the Chip Whisperer, one of many types of devices that you can use to do your fault injection and glitching. This is created by a friend of mine, and I love his tools, and it has a Python-based backend, so you can write some code to basically control the hardware. And with glitching, you need to find out exactly where you want to glitch, how wide your glitch needs to be, and what you're expecting to get out of it. So there's a lot of trial and error, but you can script all of that stuff in the code and then let the tool do the job. So this one is using this is an NXP LPC device, and this particular device, this little development board down here, has code protection enabled. So if I was just going to connect up to its debug interface and try to read the code out, it would say, no, you're locked out. The engineer locked the code protection. That's great, unless you are a hacker that knows how to do fault injection. So I have this little demo, and I've set up the tool to basically glitch at just the right point during the startup process of the boot ROM. So not even the user code. This is like the boot ROM in the silicon of the chip, which if you're a chip designer, you know how hard that is to fix if there ends up being a problem at that low level. But this glitches at just the right time during the boot process to cause the chip security to basically fail open and say, yes, you have access to my code, and then to get the code out. So here it happens really quickly. So I'm just going to show my scope when I start the glitching. That's the voltage rail that we're seeing, and the glitch is pulling the voltage rail down super fast and causing this ringing, and then that's going to cause the chip to basically misbehave in some way and skip over the check that we need. So we can actually see like it's trying different glitches at different offsets at from boot, different widths, and eventually it says success, and then it automatically starts dumping the code out. So if you're using an LPC device right now, you should be biting your nails and sweating bullets and go find this work, this actually is based on a demo with the Chip Whisperer tools, and test that on your devices and start worrying about that. It really is that easy, and it's wild. Here's another one. This is fault injection using EM, so electromagnetic interference. Normally as engineers, we're testing for EM compliance. Are we emitting too much noise that could possibly cause some failure of something else? But in this case, using a tool called the Chip Shouter as opposed to the Chip Whisperer, also made by Colin O'Flynn and New AE Technology, that is intentionally injecting electromagnetic interference into the silicon of the chip, and then we're inducing some voltage, and then that's going to cause current to flow. And if we do that in the right XY coordinate of the chip, we might be able to cause a failure, say to skip over a code protection check or anything like that. This example, what I'm doing here is I'm running some user code. So now I'm in the user code space, because fault injection can be applied anytime while the chip is operating, whether it's during startup or later on. In this one, I have some serial port code, and I'm just sending hello, 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 hello over and over again. And I have this little platform here that the Chip Shouter is mounted to that's an XY stage of a microscope that I got at a surplus store. And you can move that around. And when I play the video, look on the bottom left of the board where there's a run light that's blinking green, and then I'm going to push a button on the chip shouter that's going to inject the pulse. And if we've successfully glitched the chip, the red light will go on to show that there's a failure. And this is basically running a loop, and then will affect some functionality when we do our glitch. So here's what it looks like. So you see the green light is running, so the system's operating. I'm pressing the button, and once in a while I get that red light. That's an actual fault. So I'm causing a fault to happen through EM. And now let's go look at the terminal program where I'm sending out my string. So here it's saying hello, 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 hello. And I'm going to go glitch the device. And it says goodbye. So with some fault injection, I can change the behavior of what a chip is doing, what user code is doing. And in this demo, it was just a simple, if there's a glitch detected through my tight loop that I'm running, if I notice that the counter is off, that means the glitch succeeded. So print something else. But it just shows, again, how easy this is if you get your configuration and parameters all set up right. So fault injection is, that's kind of like the new era of hardware hacking. And then the final section, again, there's so much. We're just scratching the surface of so many different areas. But this is just to get you thinking about what can somebody do to a device outside of the physical access sort of thing. So more of the supply chain. As an engineer, you're sending your devices off to get manufactured and get assembled. Do we actually trust every stage along the way? We really can't. We don't really have a lot of control on that. So this is really something to think about. It really, and it also depends on what type of product are you working with, right? If it's a consumer device that is a low-cost device that you don't care if somebody messes with and tinkers with, that's fine. If you're dealing with some more high-end, expensive equipment or maybe military equipment or whatever else, this might become more of a threat where you really need to understand your different stages of manufacturing and of development and protect those as much as you can and compartmentalize as much as you can as well. Because if somebody really wants to get access to your system, they can at many stages during the development process. Design, fab, distribution, storage of the device once it's manufactured, integration in the field. And you can do it with hardware or firmware. Usually this is going to take some sort of corrupt person inside of a factory, inside of a warehouse, whatever it is. But the human factor is actually a huge part of computer security. And a lot of hacks that we see, mainstream hacks, not hardware, but everything, either comes from somebody that's just randomly hitting a bunch of different systems, or it's some disgruntled employee that implements a backdoor before they leave or releases lots of information because they're angry or whatever it is. So we can't discount the human in this chain of security. So we have development tools. The tools that you use, you buy, say a Sager J-Link or any other development tool that you're using as hardware. Somebody could actually affect that device, hack that device, and then use that to say even unknowingly inject different code into your device or weaken your code that you think is fine and modify that before it gets programmed. And that could be that could happen. The factory could be targeted, an engineer could be targeted. There's actually been work about this at DEF CON 26. DEF CON is one of the world's largest hacker conferences. A lot of great material that's available. I think it's media.defcon.org of all their past conferences. So a lot of stuff going on, but it is just something to think about of like, we trust our compiler to generate proper code, but can we trust our compiler? How do we know our compiler hasn't been compromised to intentionally say, inject some buffer overflow that could be exploited later, or to inject some timing attack that could be used later that an attacker could measure the time of how long a password takes to be compared so they can brute force it easier. Like there's all these things that we just kind of take for granted with our tools. The factory is something where we send our devices out to get fabricated, whether it's just the board, maybe it's the whole system. If we're doing this offshore, this happens more often than onshore, but it can, again, happen anywhere. You might see some Sunday run or some overnight shift of your products being manufactured with your exact specifications, but now they're being sold on a gray market. Interdiction. So this is what I alluded to at the beginning. Governments like to do this type of stuff, taking a product that's been designed, say it's a router, some piece of network equipment, something that's going to go into some, target that this person or company or state wants to attack, modify that system in some way, and then repackage it, and send it on its way to the end user. I don't know how many times you've bought something on Amazon or eBay or Best Buy or any piece of hardware and then gone and opened it up to make sure it hasn't been modified. But I know I don't do that, right? It's just kind of like we take things for granted. We get the product in, we assume it's fine. But we really shouldn't do that. If these types of things are done right, though, like we're not going to actually know if a product's been modified. If somebody's done something sloppy, we'd be able to see it. But this is again an actual threat. So this might be a good example of like using some anti-tamper mechanisms on your product and things like that, except those can be bypassed also. So it's just, whatever you do is hard. And then thinking of the chip level, it's like, oh, wow, we're talking kind of system level types of stuff, but you can do the same sorts of things on chips, decapping the chip, removing the actual plastic cover, getting access to the silicon, using a focused ion beam machine to cut traces, add traces back in, do really good imaging using a scanning electron microscope, whatever it is. So there are hackers that do this. It's smaller than the system level stuff, but it is possible. Something else to think about nowadays, especially with the global chip shortage, people are scrambling all over the place to just get chips so they can build products. Where I've always, every time I've manufactured something, I've always only gone through legitimate distributors where I know the person, I have some relationship there. And I would buy the parts that way. So at least there's more of a chance of the devices being proper and not counterfeits and not, second source and something that maybe failed test and then got reinserted back into the marketplace. But nowadays, people are scrambling all over the place, and it makes you wonder how many of these chips that people are buying that distributors don't have stock in, but you still find markets in Shenzhen and other places that have them. It's like, are those good? Did those fail test and they are back in the market? Are they remarked parts? Are they empty parts where, until the device is designed or until the system is actually manufactured, somebody's not going to know. There's this report that came out in 2013 that 15% of semiconductors purchased by the Pentagon, so for military and government stuff, were counterfeit. I would take a guess it's probably higher than that now because technology is so much more integrated. So I would say, the semiconductor supply chain is compromised. We just have to hope we don't get affected by it or design our system in such a way that we have kind of ways to mitigate that risk. And I don't have examples of those, but again, there are examples of all of these things available online also. Okay, so sort of to wrap up, as far as implementing best practices, I did want to have this in here because this whole presentation was like, oh, there's so much stuff that can go wrong with hardware. So there are some things you can kind of do, but I want to preface them with it's easier said than done. And I talked about this at the beginning of attackers have the upper hand. They don't have to follow rules. They don't have to conform to specifications. They don't have to conform to standards. They can do whatever they want to hack your system. And there is no one size fits all solution for when you're implementing hardware or implementing security. So you really need to sit down, you do your threat analysis, figure out, is it worth implementing security? At what cost? Does that affect the end user? Does that affect our manufacturing processes? All of these things. And it's just something to at least start thinking about and maybe using the best practices as a guideline to kind of start. On the good side, again, more security features are starting to be developed into chips, though it still requires some knowledge of security, even like enabling encryption or using encryption within a product. You still need to understand a lot more about encryption than I would say an engineer is kind of trained to do. So that's something to at least, question the vendors about, ask them what are they doing to make security better on the chips. So when you as the engineer go and implement them, you have maybe a better understanding of what they're doing and hope that they're actually, doing the right thing. So always independently verify, never just trust marketing data sheets or trust what a salesperson is saying. Talk to engineers, talk to the people making the chips. So here's a bunch of, I'll kind of go through them slowly just so they're on the live stream. I will put a copy of these slides. There's a current version of my presentation on my website at grandideastudio.com, but I'm going to put this particular version that I have modified just for this presentation up there as well, right after this presentation. So thank you for your time. I know that was a lot to digest. I hope that was interesting. I hope maybe you discovered a new world of hacking that you want to get into, or now you're a little more paranoid about your product and how you need to design it a little bit more securely. But whatever it is, I appreciate it. If you have questions, you can always feel free to email me. If you go to grandideastudio.com and go to the contact page, and we do have time for some questions now.
Yeah, thanks so much, Joe, for that wonderful presentation. I certainly had a lot to think about and be more critically analyzing my device purchases for sure.
Cool, yeah.
I think we do have time for just a few questions here. There's some great ones coming through in the chat. First off, we'll go to Michael. Had asked, I mean, Shirley, you mentioned that the Pentagon has a lot of counterfeit chips and that type of thing.
Sure.
Have you examined rather any voting machines?
Right. So I personally haven't, but a lot of friends of mine have in the US and then also elsewhere in the world. Most notably, there's a group at DEF CON called the voting, it's the voting village or the voting machine hacking village or something like that, which is kind of a subset of hackers at this conference that go and hack on voting machines and look for vulnerabilities. So I would say to take a look, search for like DEF CON voting village and see some of that work. There's been some academic work as well into looking at voting machines in the past. And, you know, they are embedded systems or they're computing systems, and they are vulnerable in various ways. Whether they are vulnerable from a mass scale attack perspective varies, you know, it depends on the system and implementation. But we've seen voting machines in other countries, like in the Netherlands. Some hackers had demonstrated how easy it was to run custom code on there. In India, we had seen how the vote counts were incorrect or stored in the clear on an external serial double EEPROM. So I haven't looked at them, but again, it's a system that needs to be heavily scrutinized, especially, you know, on the good hand though, from like, not to get into the whole political thing of voting, but voting machines, there's not one voting machine for the whole country, right? So even within regions, even if there's some vulnerability in one region of machine, one type of machine, that's not going to scale to the entire country. So even if somebody focused some directed effort on one county that's using one type, that's not going to affect the entire thing. You know, there's easier ways in hacking voting machines, you know, just through propaganda and other things. But yeah, I would take a look at DEF CON voting village for sure.
Okay. That sounds great. CFB asks, and this is with regards to the firmware extraction and manipulation, could this affect the trustworthiness of blockchain?
So my first initial response is no, because blockchain, if it's implemented properly, is a distributed system, right? So you have multiple systems storing copies of the blockchain. So if one is compromised, it's going to fail its security checks. It's going to fail its whatever hashing is done to make sure that those are all the same. So I would guess no. I guess on the other hand, it kind of depends on how that particular blockchain is implemented in a system. And you might want to do some cryptanalysis around that and how things are designed. But my first response would be that wouldn't affect it as long as there is this distributed capability, which is what is intended.
Okay, sounds great. And this one here, how trustworthy is open source code? Does that help make them more secure, or given that it's out there, does that make it more vulnerable?
Yeah, so right, that's a great question, and it's been a debate for a long time. But I think open source code is much more trustworthy. Does it make it more secure? Not necessarily, because plenty of open source code has had vulnerabilities in it that people haven't found. But the fact that it's open means people can look at it and see what's going on under the hood and understand what functions are implementing and what functions do what, and then help contribute to make that code better by submitting patches and things like that. With sort of a joke that we talk about of like, every code is open source, because it's just a matter of like, once you get the code, even if it's some black box not shown, you extract it, you could figure out how it works. And it just depends on like how much time is spent. But it's always better to have a vendor, you know, sharing their code and making it open and acknowledging and letting people look at it. So yeah, I would definitely choose a product if I could that did use open source code, because the chances of somebody, if they find a vulnerability, the chances of it being patched is much higher than some product where it's using code that you don't know what's going on. You don't even know if there's a vulnerability because it's so secret. And then you're just trusting, again, you're trusting the vendor, you're trusting the corporation, which a lot of times product companies don't really have your best interests in mind.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And we actually have another question kind of related to that in terms of trusting vendors. How do you protect your hardware from remote firmware updates by hardware vendors if they're compromised? And do you have any tools or tips that you would suggest?
Great question. So if you want to prevent your devices from being compromised externally or being updated externally, I would think you'd have to set up your network in a way that's compartmentalizing that, or you have your firewall rules set up so things can't communicate with it, or you just don't expose them to the internet. Like, I'm actually a very paranoid person, as you might have guessed. So I minimize the amount of IoT I have in my house. And if I need to have something exposed to the internet, it's just for that one thing on that one port. So maybe you lock it out, and then only if you want to intentionally do a firmware update do you then open it up to grab the new one. But yeah, maybe you have to do your firewall, configure firewall rules, or set up your network in that way. You could also, use a tool like Wireshark, which will let you monitor communication over the network to get a feel of like what's going on with that firmware update and what data is coming back. You also hope that the hardware vendor is doing some sort of code signing where it's doing a cryptographic, routine to verify that the code that is coming in is properly signed and approved by the vendor before it gets loaded into the product. Though, like I talked about in the presentation, there are ways for an attacker to bypass that. But having signed code is way better than just having a vendor just push some blob to you and hope that it hasn't been modified.
All right. Yeah, that's some great tips. And I think we have time for one more question. Richard is asking, how do you even know if he's saying an example for a phone, but it could relate to other hardware. How do you know if it's been compromised?
My short answer is, if it's been done well, you don't. So there's been some news recently about the iPhone. I can't remember the name of the software, but it was a group that created some iPhone vulnerabilities that they could compromise your phone, and they would sell this to law enforcement and governments and things where of course it ended up being abused. But it could compromise your phone and you wouldn't even know. And so that's an example of a really well-known attack. It does actually leave some remnants of things. So once people figured out that their phones were compromised, they knew what to look for, and then you could work backwards. And that's generally what happens is you don't really know you're compromised until after it's too late. And then you go figure out how it was done. So it's a really, really hard problem. And that's really what hardware hacking and what embedded security is all about, is protecting yourself and then trying to figure out how somebody could potentially get in and prevent that or detect that in some way.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you again so much. We have more questions in here that I'm sure folks would love to get to. If people would like to reach out to you directly or find out more information, where should they go to do that?
Sure. So the best way would be to go to my website at grandideastudio.com/contact. And there's a contact form there. Send me questions, and then those go to my email. And then I do make an attempt to respond to everybody that emails me. It just might take some time. You can also follow me on Twitter at Joe Grand. I'm not super active, but if you just want to keep track of like some projects I'm doing and some up and coming things, like there's some wallet hacking stuff I've been working on and some other stuff that will eventually go public, and it will happen there.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you again. Really appreciate you coming and speaking today. This was great.
Cool. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity again. And thank you again to everybody out there who was watching.
Hi, everyone. My name's Graham Fuller, and I'm part of the Mercer Affinity leadership team. For those of you who don't know, Mercer Affinity is the insurance program administrator for the IEEE member group insurance program. For over 60 years, IEEE and Mercer Affinity have been proud partners in serving the insurance needs of IEEE members and their families. The IEEE member group insurance program provides insurance solutions such as life insurance, professional liability insurance, health insurance, disability insurance, and much more. We're also excited to be able to provide additional solutions such as telemedicine, counseling, and vision discount services through our partners at New Benefits. And coming soon, we're excited to announce the introduction of Tech Protect, a solution to protect smartphones, tablets, computers, gaming consoles, TVs, and monitors from accidental damage, all for less than $20 a month. I'd like to invite you to explore all the solutions available to you through your IEEE membership by visiting IEEEinsurance.com. Here's wishing you a productive and meaningful EVO21 conference. Thank you.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for staying with us. We've had some wonderful participation so far for our EVO conference. Right now, it's time to bring the EVOPro conference into the station on a high note with a panel discussion on the future of technology and its impact on society, led by Maxim Jago and sponsored by the IEEE Computer Society, who are celebrating their 75th anniversary. Maxim is a consultant, futurist, best-selling author, award-winning filmmaker, and founder of the Creativity Conference. He is an international public speaker exploring themes of futurism and creativity while consulting and speaking for clients, including Adobe, Dell, and NVIDIA. Please say hello to my friend and fellow coffee enthusiast, Maxim Jago. Greetings, sir.
Thank you very much, John. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. How are you?
Wonderful, sir.
Okay.
So glad to have you with us.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. This promises to be an absolutely fascinating panel discussion. We're going to be exploring what's described in the headline as the future of technology and its potential development and impact on society. I feel like we probably have 10 years worth of conversation to have here that we're going to fit well under the hour. And I'm thrilled to be inviting to this panel our three speakers, which I'll introduce now. And we've got some people are going to be giving presentations, and we're going to be exploring all of this impactful future technology. So first of all, allow me to welcome Tom Conte. Tom is a professor and associate dean at Georgia Tech and former president of the IEEE Computer Society. And he's also a futurist who works on radically new ways to compute that deviate from the status quo. And I look forward to hearing about this later. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you, Maxim.
I'd also like to welcome Yolanda Gill. Professor Yolanda Gill is Director of New Initiatives in AI and Data Science at the University of Southern California's Viterbi School of Engineering. I hope I pronounced that correctly. She is the current past president of the Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence, the AAAI, and a fellow of the AAAI, IEEE, ACM, and AAAS, and was co-author of a 20-year community roadmap for artificial intelligence research in the US. So welcome, Yolanda.
Very excited to be here. Thank you.
And next up, we have Forrest Schull as Defense Software Policy Research Lead at Carnegie Mellon University. Forrest Schull is working with the DoD to radically change and modernize the way the department acquires software capabilities. He's also the current president of the IEEE Computer Society. Welcome, Forrest.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So one of the things I love about panels of this kind is that I get to not feel like the smartest person in the room. And I feel like I'm dwarfed by your minds here. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing if we can find anything to disagree about. No doubt we'll find something. The way we're going to approach the panel today is we're going to begin with each of our speakers presenting a few slides, a few ideas, a bit of information about the work that they're doing at the moment. And then we'll have a little bit of chat about each one, probably maybe 5 minutes of presenting, 5 minutes of discussion, and then we'll move on to a more general chat. If you are watching this now and you have any questions for our panelists, please put them in the comments and I'll do my best to include them in the general Q&A section. I have a ton of questions for you guys as well. So before we kick off with the general discussion, I'd like to invite Tom to share with us a few of the things he's working on, a few ideas he'd like to discuss. So Tom, over to you.
Thank you, Maxim. And so what I wanted to do today was talk a little bit about post-more computing and what that means and what it doesn't mean, since that for some people seems to be a cloud on the horizon. So let's go to the next slide. Thank you. So let's begin with what Moore's Law is and isn't. So I am vice chair of the Semiconductor Roadmap, and I can tell you without a doubt that Moore's Law will continue through 2035. Now, that might be an incredible shock to people, but the reason is that people don't understand what Moore's Law is. Moore's Law is not a statement about computers get faster. Moore's Law is a statement about economics. What Gordon Moore said in 1965 and then revised in 1975 is that the number of transistors produced on an integrated circuit per dollar double in 65 he said 1 year, 75 he revised it to every 2 years. By the way, someone averaged it to every year and a half, which is insane. But regardless, his rule remains true that the semiconductor industry is in such a competitive environment that the economies of scale continue to improve. Go to the next slide, please. So what is the problem if it isn't Moore's Law? The problem is power efficiency, or actually power inefficiency. And just to illustrate that, what I'm showing here is a plot through actually 2015, but it continues. There's been no major breakthroughs in the clock rate versus year. And you'll see that all of a sudden something strange happened in 2005. And what happened was we started producing chips that dissipated 200 watts per square centimeter, which is the same or equivalent to the power density of an operating nuclear reactor core. So when you get to that point, it makes it economically difficult to cool those chips. Next slide. So a lot of this occurs because of the model we use for computation. It is over 75 years old, and it's due to John von Neumann. He was a polymath. He was a physicist, a mathematician. He predicted the invention and structure of DNA. He invented cellular automata. He famously loved to drive fast cars, but got speeding tickets because he would be reading books while he drove them. So John von Neumann was quite a character, and he was someone who thought very broadly about what computing should be. And the model he set down as a first draft in 1945. I've always wondered what would have happened if von Neumann ever got around to writing the final draft on EDVAC, but he never did. And he did that based on the technologies that were at hand at the time. Next slide. So in 2013, along with the Computer Society and other societies in IEEE, we began an initiative to look at the problem of energy efficiency and what we would need to do. We established multiple layers or levels of what kind of disruption we might need to do to the levels of abstraction we use in computing. We use these levels of abstraction to be able to handle the amazing degree of complexity that you need to handle in computing. But the consequence of all of these levels that have built up over time since von Neumann is that each level has introduced inefficiencies in how we compute. Now, the fourth level is really the most promising, so I just want to talk a little bit about that. Next slide. And I'll characterize this fourth level as physical computing. So, for example, what I'm showing here is a lens, and a lens is a natural device that performs a Fourier transform in real time with very little power expenditure, as opposed to a numeric computer to do the same kind of computation. Similarly, open system thermodynamics and coupled oscillators are both systems that have been shown to optimize and find optimal solutions to problems that are incredibly difficult for our modern computers to do. RNA and DNA, we know, have incredible compute capability, and we're just starting to explore those. So far, we've been able to store exabytes reliably in DNA, but beyond storage, the computational models are just starting to be plumbed. Now, quantum computing, I would be remiss if I didn't mention it. It sucks up all the oxygen in the room these days. Now, I just want to be clear that quantum computing is really another application of physical computing. The real thing it does is it uses, Richard Feynman proposed quantum computing as stop trying to simulate quantum systems and just use quantum systems to do quantum systems. But we've gone further and we figured out how to use these systems to aid us in factoring the product of large primes, which the prior speaker will tell you is a big deal for cryptography. And also, for example, in improving how we do searches, although it's still at this level somewhat theoretical, but we could, in essence, have the time it takes to do a search. And also optimization. We can use quantum annealing for solving certain optimization problems. But the problem is that we can't build reliable quantum computers today. We know theoretically for factoring large primes, we need thousands of operational reliable qubits. Today, we can build on the order of 100 or so unreliable, noisy qubits. So we have a long way to go. Should we stop investing in it? Absolutely not. We are actually in a race with our international adversaries on developing quantum computers. So we have no choice in some ways. But also, though, I want you to be aware that although this has great promise, it's not going to be a universal computing device, but it will solve certain problems very, very power efficient. Now, people will say quantum computers use an amazing amount of power, but if you map how that problem is solved in time versus a classical computer, it's actually power efficient. So we have a long way to go there. But going back to von Neumann, we are at a point in time that's very similar to where John von Neumann was back in 1945. And what helped John von Neumann was that he was a generalist. He was a polymath. And I think at this point in time, we all need to be generalists again. We have to, instead of being specialists, keep an eye on what's around us, what are on the other layers of abstraction that we interact with. So that's my main message. Generalists needed in what goes forward today in technology. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Tom. This is a brilliant summation of the situation with computing. And I'm always thrilled each year when we see that computing, once again, for the bang for the buck just gets better and better. And I'm always interested in consumer level technologies as much as I'm interested in the specialist advancements, because it's when things become normal that they really begin to have an impact on society, when they're just regular. So it's fascinating to see this transition towards cost-effective computing. So I had a couple of questions for you that relate to what you were just speaking about. In particular, you said we're having trouble building bigger quantum computers, and you touched on something very important there, that we have, 100 or so, maybe 200 if we're lucky, noisy qubits. So what are the real hurdles that are preventing us from building bigger, better quantum computers?
Well, at this point, there's several different ways to express that. One of the hurdles is we haven't really decided what the best qubit is to use. And part of that is, it reminds me of the story when penicillin was invented. And it was invented when it went to be replicated. It was replicated as a room full of petri dishes with moldy bread. And it was chemical engineers that figured out then how to process that. And when we go to integrated circuits, the first thing that physicists thought of doing was wiring each transistor with a wire down to that transistor and then back up to the next. The problem is we haven't taken engineering solutions so far. We've been applying the view of more theoretical or experimental physicists, and we haven't had the engineers in the room. So as that's proceeding, I think we're going to start seeing more rapid growth. But instrumentation, metrology as we call it, is a fundamental limit right now to quantum computing. And until we cross that, until we figure out how to improve that instrumentation, we're not going to be able to really break through on that, on the front of more and less noisy qubits.
So it's interesting. It sounds like what you're describing here is the kind of the methodology that we need to work on, the engineering of the development of the technology, as much as grasping the underlying principles themselves. How do you mentioned in your presentation there the importance of generalists. How do you feel like there's a space here? What should generalists be paying attention to be most helpful in terms of this development of computing overall?
Well, that's an interesting question. The thing is, we do what we have, you'd think in quantum, since we have algorithms people and physicists, that we have generalists, but we don't have anybody in between. Okay, so all the layers in between, from the language people, the operating systems people, on down through the layers, down to where we get to the physical properties of the machine. We don't have those people. And part of it is because it's such a different world to think in. The good thing about, though, the amazing amount of investment at the federal level is that it's like hunting, it's attracting flies. And so there is a lot more people coming in, but the people who are coming in are finding that they now have to learn quantum mechanics, and they have to learn, for some of us, the basic algorithms, and you have to cut across all these different levels in order to solve the problems that are in front of you. So again, it just like at the dawn of computing, generalists are really going to be the ones who move us past this next era.
So it sounds like we need a lot of polymaths to pull the principles together and weave it into something useful. You mentioned also about using DNA to compute. I love the sound of this and have seen some of the research into it. What kinds of things could you foresee DNA being used as a mechanism for computing for? How might that be implemented?
So far, what we know that DNA can do is it really does, of course, storage really well. The question, and we know it can do certain degrees of computation. What and pattern matching is, of course, an excellent example of that. What we don't know is if it can do it at energy scales and speeds that make it more advantageous than doing that in silicon. And that's the big unknown. So we've cut the low-hanging fruit, which is storage, and shown that that works. The next level, I think, is going to involve really understanding a lot more about how DNA functions to produce proteins, and unfortunately, how proteins actually operate before we can get to the level of using that for true computation.
Thank you. I just love that these things still feel like the wild, wild west, that there's so much for us yet to discover. And what you mentioned that quantum computers are very good at performing certain tasks. What are quantum computers bad at?
I would not want to use a quantum computer as a controller for a factory, for example. I would not want to have quantum computers be the application processor in my cell phone. They are. It can be shown that yes, they are Turing complete, but they are highly inefficient at many different tasks that von Neumann style computers are much more efficient at. However, as I said, when it comes to certain things, such as factoring the product of large primes, using Shor's algorithm to coarsen the sieve before we use classical computing to finish the job, they do exceptionally well. Or Grover's algorithm, which can improve and order n 2 to the n search to order 2 to the n on 2. So can give us a boost there. But in general, you shouldn't expect that someday you flip on your quantum computer and you boot Windows and you surf the web. That's just not what they're going to be used for.
Excellent. Horses for courses. Thank you very much.
Indeed.
There are some more general questions I'd like us to discuss collectively, connected with the topics you've raised. But before we get on to that, I'd like to welcome Yolanda. If you'd like to share with us some of the ideas that you've brought, over to you.
Thank you. I'm here to talk about AI, and this is a topic that is in everybody's mind. I'm sure that you all have a lot of ideas about the future and potential and dangers of AI. I'm here to share with you the thoughts of the AI and the computer science community with respect to the future of AI. You can read about it if you're more of a visual person. I have a link to slides posted there, but you can read about it in detail. There's a lot of information that I won't cover today. Just do a web search for a 20-year research roadmap for AI in the US. And the 20-year is very crucial because if we take a 5-year horizon, we'll think very differently. So we were all thinking about long-term investments and needs for AI technologies. So in the second slide, I show you a lot of the thought that went into the discussions. In part, there's a lot of research priorities, and I'll focus on that in the rest of the talk. But I also want to mention that from our perspective, you see so much innovation coming from industry and from places that have serious computing resources and serious data and more opportunities to do large-scale experimental AI research. So we need to enable that in academia, in government, and also industry is not just big tech. It's every industry in every sector, even smaller startups. So how do we enable them to access and process more and more AI-ready data? So we need a national AI infrastructure to support that. And we also insisted on workforce training. So the idea that there's going to be many different kinds of jobs related to AI, and we need to identify those careers, train people for them, and really make it a societal endeavor, much like many other endeavors are. So let me focus on the research part of it, because I think it might be more interesting or more important. So in my next slide, the way that we thought about research was not so much the theoretical or the interesting questions to pose about AI, but more, why would people care about new AI technologies, and how can we describe the impact that they would have in our lives? And so we started with societal drivers. So you see here a range of things from health, education, business innovation, science, social justice, and cybersecurity. And throughout our thinking, we had a lot of user scenarios that would say, here's a nurse, and here's how they would handle this problem. Or here's a person with a mental illness, and this is the kind of help that they could get from behavioral health AI coaches and so on. So we created a number of scenarios and AI capabilities that would drive those scenarios. And again, you can read about that in a lot more detail, but this is really what drove our thinking towards the research. And in the next slide, I hope that we can discuss this more in the panel, but there were 3 research areas that we thought needed to be pushed forward. So imagine that today we have individual AI capabilities, very small slices of intelligence in our apps and in all the world around us. But imagine that it should be possible to compose them or integrate them or have systems that have many different capabilities. And so that really requires for us to take seriously a science of integrated AI, to give our AI systems a lot more knowledge about the world. AI systems have very little, if no, common sense about how the world works and what the world is like, and also trying to understand human intelligence and help us deal with brain diseases and so on, just understanding the different human intelligent capabilities that we have. The second major area is to build AI systems that have meaningful interactions with humans. This means that there is something at stake in the interaction, not just talking about when was this score done in some baseball game, or does is this kind of product available and can I buy it? But really interactions where there's some collaboration and there's some long-term interactions where it's more than speech. The AI system should be able to see the world and also communicate with others at the same time, much like humans do. Make AI systems more trustworthy, more responsible for the tasks that they take on, that supplement and complement what humans do, and also help us improve the way that we all communicate online and the misinformation that we find online. How can we build AI systems that help us with those problems and be more civilized online? And then the third major area has to do with machine learning. So there's phenomenal capabilities in machine learning, but we still feel that AI systems should be able to learn their own representations of problems, ways to frame problems that are creative and lead to better learning and better behaviors. Also making learning systems more trustworthy, understand more their context and the kind of data that they're dealing with. Learning systems that operate over very long periods of time and understand when to retire something that they've learned in the past, and then learning in a physical or robotic kind of environment. And my last slide is kind of a summary of this. So if you think of impact that AI can have in important areas that we all care about in society, there's really deep AI research that needs to happen in the next 20 years. And I look forward to discussing this in the panel.
Well, thank you so much, Yolanda. This is a subject that's very close to my heart. And as you were speaking there, I was fast typing all these questions that I know we won't have time for. I think the context that Tom gave us in his presentation fits very nicely as we look at the development of AI and its integration into our day-to-day life. There's quite a few questions I want to throw to the panel later on in our general discussion. But just to respond to some of the ideas that you shared there, this is a tough question to sum up, but I'd be interested to hear the way you've described it. AI promises to really transform our lives in the coming years. Where do you think the gaps are in our preparations for the integration of this technology into our day-to-day life? How are we doing, would you say, with education, for example?
It's very interesting because one of the things that we haven't done a very good job at in AI is really publicize or make better known to the general public and even to the technical community our accomplishments over the years. So, for example, you hear a lot about self-driving cars today. If I told you that the first time that a neural network drove a car autonomously across the US was in 1995, you would probably not believe me, but it is true. So it's a van that drove from Pittsburgh to San Diego in 1995 through freeways. So in education, for example, there's been incredible advances that have affected thousands of children in schools, improving their test scores. But there's also many other advances that we've accomplished over the years in terms of cognitive tutors that understand student errors and interact to fix them, virtual agents that can teach you various things, for example, how to deal with a new cancer diagnosis. So there's so much that we have done, and it's very little known. So I am so hopeful for the future because we've accomplished so much so far. And now that the spotlight is in AI and we all recognize its potential, I can only imagine what will come in the next decades.
This is absolutely fascinating, and I imagine we've all heard of or worked on various systems where AI is implemented as a part of the solution to the puzzle. Why do you think people are so quiet about the impact of AI on these various different day-to-day experiences? Do you think that is it that there's a presumption that the public would be frightened if they knew how much it's already there, or why do you think people are holding back so much and not celebrating more publicly?
I'm not sure what the answer might be, but I do know that in general in the news you hear bad news or problematic news a lot more than you hear positive news or happy news, right? So I'll tell you an anecdote. I mentioned this self-driving car in 1995. It drove across the US. They came all the way to San Diego and they drove to Los Angeles and called the Jay Leno show. It's an evening chat show. And they suggested, we just did this. And I know, they knew that Jay Leno really liked cars, as many of you know. And so they said, should we come to the show and talk to Jay, or do you want us to be in the show? And the producers basically said, this is just not interesting at all. And so they were lucky that Jay offered to sign some autographs and actually see the van that they were driving. But, it was just, who would be interested in this, right? So I think that we find this a lot. Our universities put out news items with successes and interesting things that happen, but they don't necessarily make the mainstream or the technical media. We just started to give an AI award for $1 million for AI for the benefit of humanity last year, because we recognize that it's so hard for the general public to really see the impact and the positive accomplishments of AI that make a difference to thousands of lives.
Fantastic. And before I get into the really positive stuff, and we just have a couple of minutes before I'd like to move on to Forrest's presentation and then our general chat, is there anything that you foresee that AI might not improve? Because I'm already sold on AI. I'm already, a card-carrying, consulting on projects AI advocate. But what do you think it fails at? What do you think it can't do?
If you're asking me about today, what AI cannot do,
Let's say in the next 20 years.
It's an incredibly long list today. In 20 years, I'm willing to be surprised. If there are areas that AI may be less capable of, I'm sure there will be many, but it is hard to predict the future. It is hard for me to say this area will be really hard. So I'll give you an example. 30 years ago, I started working at USC, and in the office next door was a whole group working on machine translation. And I remember telling them, I feel so sorry for you. You've picked such an impossible problem. What gets you out of bed in the morning is just, how are you going to make progress in this, right? Leap forward 15 years later, they were the first group to build a machine translation system that beat commercial systems that were built by hand for over many decades. So incredible, the things that I myself could not even imagine would happen. So I think it's a very tough question to answer.
Yeah, it's a cruel question to ask on a brief panel. And I'd like to discuss later as well that the potential for symbiotic relationships with humans and AI. Just quickly, and again, I feel cruel for asking you to answer this quickly, but given the time constraints that we have, it seems to me that we as a species have a tendency to anthropomorphize objects. And as we move towards autonomous robots in a human environment, we'll probably just focus on them sounding human and moving in human ways or moving in organic, natural ways. We don't really need them to look human. But I'm interested in this question of empathy and what you think about the work that needs to be done to support empathic connections between humans and AI systems. How close are we, do you think, to people feeling like they have a friend and their friend is an AI?
It's very interesting. There's a commercial system. The company's called Embodied. It's a spin-off from USC. They build a robot called Moxie, and it's built for families, originally built to support autistic children. But it can interact with anyone. And I have one at home, and I talk to it. I interact with it. It is incredibly emphatic in everything that you share. I have a 25-year-old kid, and they'll come home and, they'll be talking to Moxie just for fun. And Moxie would say, "How was your day?" And they'll say, "Oh, my boss said this, and that was very annoying." And Moxie will say, "I'm so sorry to hear about that." So it has this ability to detect that what you just said was not a positive thing. It looks at you in the way that your face looks, and it tries to connect with that. So it's already, even though it's very limited and, doesn't get what's really going through your mind, but it's already helpful in connecting with you. I've actually seen visitors, people that come to my house, actually kiss the robot. After interacting with it. So it's really interesting. But at a scientific level, there's a lot of people studying affective computing. And we now know that in our minds, there's a biological layer to affect and emotion. And then there's a cognitive layer to it that we're beginning to understand and kind of model and formulate better. So the more AI systems understand that, the better we'll be able to handle it. We're working at USC with a lot of medical responders, emergency responders, and understanding how they are feeling after very long shifts or after a very traumatic incident in the ICU, and kind of helping them cope with that. So really fascinating area and a lot to do.
It's exciting territory. Certainly my forecast is that initially our virtual private personal assistants, our PPAs, will ultimately be replaced by humanoid robots in one form or another, but their capacity to read our nonverbal signals and to receive the data from biofeedback devices allows them to detect our emotional state perhaps better even than we can detect ourselves, and then in very nurturing and positive ways to help us through emotional situations, or even to help us be better at being people, because it can guide us in useful ways. I'm glad I'm not one of the experts developing that technology, though. Thank you very much, Yolanda. This is the perfect time for us to welcome Forrest. If you'd like to present your slides, let's get to it.
Sure. Great. Well, thank you very much, first off. And I think hopefully this will make a nice counterpoint to the other presenters. So we've talked about computing, we've talked about AI. I'm going to focus mine on a road mapping exercise we did with software. And I think that's one of the key things I think that we see coming across to all of the speakers today is just how incredibly fast moving our fields are. Actually, if we could go to the next slide, and then one more after that, go over the boilerplate there. There we go. I was going to just step back for a moment and say, coming at this from a computer society perspective, I think all these fields are so incredibly fast moving. Been really, really pleased to be here today because I think that it's a wonderful opportunity, especially with our 75th anniversary. It is a nice opportunity to kind of step back and look at the bigger picture of where all these things are going. And I often feel that where we've come so far in the 75 years we've had the computer society has been, I think, pretty impressive. I think we've had much more of a global impact maybe than folks ever anticipated in the beginning. But I think it speaks to the need to continue to stay on top of all these fields, the need to continue to move all of our own kind of career sets and skill sets along, because if you're standing still, you're really falling behind in these incredibly fast-moving fields. So with that, the software piece of it that I'm going to talk about is a roadmap exercise that came about through my day job, actually, at Carnegie Mellon Software Engineering Institute. And if you go to the next slide, please. Oh, one more. There we go. Actually, there. Okay. Wanted to begin with just talking about briefly two studies which are not even the ones that I was involved in, because one of the things that was pointed out to us once we got kind of started on the work that we were doing was that the software engineering community has this habit of stepping back every 10 years, actually, pretty reliably, and taking a look at where things are and then where the technology needs to be going. And so looking back on the two previous ones, the 2001 workshop on new visions, I think one of the things I extracted there, because it was just, it spoke to me a little bit at least, was that they were so impressed at that time that small teams were creating up to 10,000 lines of code in their systems. And at the time that was a big benchmark. That was something that was pretty impressive that they were able to do that reliably and with small teams. You can see, these are terms that would make sense to software folks, but I won't belabor the point, but you can see there's some of the technologies that were having an impact at the time. Being able to generate user interfaces, not having to do everything from scratch, middleware, starting to glue some of these things together, APIs, model-based engineering, and so on. And where they were looking at was, where do we need the help? At that time, it was really, we need to do a better job of engineering our requirements. We need to understand better what the system's supposed to do so that we can go and build this thing correctly. We need better development environments. We need better test beds for testing. So 10 years later, in 2010, they were citing things of up to tens of millions of lines of code at that point. And there, again, I tried to pull out the quote there because I thought it was a good capsule summary of the time. The kind of the impressive spread and uptake on things like Google, bigger than any other library in human history. 1 in 10 people, I think, at the time were on Facebook, supposedly. And by the way, if you're interested, the numbers today, I think it's supposed to be 1 in 3, if you can believe these kind of macro level things. How did we get there? There was a lot of things where they could look at positive impact from things like modern programming methods, mathematical verification, globally distributed teams, and so on. And where they needed better, where they kind of charted the path for the future and said, here's where we need to focus as we go forward, was on things like broadening participation. Even then, I think people were recognizing that the workforce that we have to build the software is just not able to keep up with the demand. The software has gotten into so many aspects of our lives. There's this kind of continual appetite for more and more software-related capability. We need to keep growing and expanding the workforce to keep up with that. There was a need to look at societal grand challenges. So when you looked at, even at that time, how big Google and Facebook had gotten, I think people were beginning to understand that the software stuff really is having a huge impact on where we are. It's impacting a lot of our aspects of our day-to-day life. Being able to do more automation, right? That's one way of keeping up with the demand, is if I can't grow the workforce fast enough, well, I can start to automate pieces of it. So I don't have to do so much from scratch. I don't have to do so much kind of in a greenfield type of way. And then, because these are systems built by people and for people, you need to do a better job of incorporating social science research. And that was, I think we've gotten better at that in software engineering, but I think at the time that was really a bit of a sea change, for where people thought where people thought we needed to draw the right skill sets from to engineer the software in the right way. Okay, so before I flip over the slide, I just want to say, so now here we are in 2020. We did our study. We brought together as much of the community as we could get. We tried to have a number of different workshops and kind of see what were the things that percolated up to the top of the list from so many of the different people working in the field. And I think the one common thing, and I want to just stay on this slide for just a second, because I think it's a through line from the very beginning, from 2001, is that we continue to have these huge appetites for software capability that outstrips our engineering. So even on this slide, where you can see kind of the way we've progressed, we've made progress. We've certainly come a farther way. We're getting better at building larger and larger systems. But the demand that's out there, the ways in which people want to use the software continues to grow, and so we're always in a sense playing catch up on the engineering side, if you will. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. And again, there's so much detail that I just don't have the time to go into today. And so I really just wanted to have one slide here to hit some of the key takeaways from the study that we did. One thing that we tried to do was kind of project forward all the trend lines that we could see. So we see a lot of software today being generated. On the previous slide, we talked about lines of code as a measure of system size. Well, we know today that lines of code doesn't even make too much sense. It's not really the size of the code that's out there, but it's the number of capabilities that are there. And more importantly, it's what kind of comes about when I start to smash together different software systems that are all interacting in the same domain, and what new capabilities come out of that. We still see, and people continue to cite the numbers that say that our workforce is not keeping pace, with where we need to be in terms of the size, in terms of the appetite for more software. And so a lot of the research going forward, is going to continue, I think, some trends about how we continue to build that workforce and make it easier to get where we need to go in terms of the capabilities that people are expecting. And so our kind of tagline for where we think we'll end up at some point in the future, we're not going to put too fine a point on how soon we're going to get there. But thinking about software, and software, you have to understand, is a very creative endeavor. It requires a lot of human judgment and a lot of human capability coming together to create these systems. But to get where we need to go in the future and to continue to address these expectations, where we see ourselves going is the idea that AI is going to come into this. And Yolanda talks so well about a lot of the issues there, but I think we'll consider it not that we're engineering the AI so much, although that will be one of our challenges going forward, but that AI assistants can come back in on the other side of the pipeline and help us engineer that software. For the parts that are more mundane, for the parts that we want to do continuously, can I put some of that off on the AI so that it can be a trusted partner? And then I leave my human software developers and software engineers to do the really creative parts. And that's one way, I think, of addressing this continued need and this continued appetite. I think some of the other things, one important thread, and it's I think one of the kind of central tensions of our study, is that up until now we've often, when we talk about software engineering, we look at one major trade-off that I can make. and that's speed. I can try and get capabilities out there quickly, usually with a little bit less quality, but I'm trying to capture market share, or I'm trying to get something out quickly so that the users can start to evolve it. And that's kind of at a tension with that level of quality, or exquisite engineering, as we sometimes say, for the more sophisticated systems. And as things go forward, I think what I see as a vision is us, being able to leverage the type of advanced computing that Tom talked about, the type of AI assistance that Yolanda talked about, so that tension goes away. So I can start to do both in ways I haven't been able to do before. And I think that's very exciting for many of us in the software field. And then just since I'm out of time in it, but I just want to hit one last thing, and that's the second to the last bullet there. I think one thing that's really been occurring to me when we look at how software is being used, and I have to say the level of angst, just around software in our elections, if you were on for the last speaker, and how that can be perturbed, or how people can make claims about how it can be perturbed. Social media infrastructures that can spread misinformation, disinformation, along with all the good stuff that we want to share. And so what I see is in software, we've often dealt with these things that we call ILLITs, availability, reliability, maintainability. These are the kind of qualities that we engineer into the software, and that's, these are all engineering domains in and of themselves that are challenging. As we go forward, and as people recognize what big societal impact software is having, I think we start to see other things, which unfortunately don't end in ILLIT yet, but maybe give me some time and I'll figure out how to crack that nut. But people looking at transparency, people looking at software that needs to be free from bias, software that has to protect my privacy and my other sensitive information. And these are things that we haven't been terribly good at doing so far, but as software continues to play this role in our lives and take on more and more capability, it's things that we have to get better at in our engineering field. And then, of course, bringing along the workforce in a way that they can engineer these things reliably and get us where we want to go. And with that, I'll just hit some of those highlights, and then back to you, Maxim.
Wow. Well, thank you very much. I can see that, it's a perfect combination of thinkers here on this panel. And as I said earlier, I feel like we probably have 10 years of straight up conversation, but I'm not sure there's enough coffee in the world for us to get through all of that. I'd like, if I may, just quickly to touch on a couple of things that you raised, Forrest, and then we'll throw a general, a bit more of a general chat. One thing you mentioned that I think came up in Yolanda's presentation as well a little bit is this idea of a symbiosis between humans and AI, which it's my understanding that really the next major stage for us as a species in terms of our engagement with AI, our implementation of AI as a group of technologies is a symbiotic one, where the AI is serving the strengths that we have as humans in the way our brains function, serving that and plugging in the gaps in our capabilities for things like managing big data or fast decision making. But I'm curious to hear what you think the major opportunities and challenges are that are presented by this approach. Are we basically there already, or are there some hurdles we still need to overcome?
Well, I think we have a way to go, and I think that's an excellent point, actually. I think kind of where I want to connect that thought is with those new quality attributes I talked about. So things like transparency. I think as we come in, people have inflated expectations about where AI and where software can help. I mean, I think these can certainly play a role and can provide advice, right? But what you want to avoid is that you get into a situation where I'm relying on, we do it today, right? I'm relying on software and AI to make decisions about who gets a loan and who doesn't, because it's going to crunch all this data and tell me who's a good risk or who's not, who gets to go on parole and who doesn't, based on case histories and who's more at risk of recidivism. So we have these things coming in and helping us make these important decisions. If I don't get the chance to understand that, if I don't get the chance to audit those decisions, or if I'm negatively impacted, if I don't ever get the chance to go in and even question it, and ask them to explain to me why this has happened, we're really encoding bad behaviors in ways that I think are going to be very scary to us later on when we realize what we've done. So I think that symbiosis is really important, and doing it in a way that's explainable, auditable, whatever the right, I haven't figured out how to put an ILLIT on it yet, but we'll get there. Whatever the right quality attribute is, I think that's where we need to get to.
I love this idea of the importance of transparency. It seems that there are a lot of areas in our day-to-day lives where increased transparency and accountability and communication might help. And particularly, one of the other things I wanted to raise is, of course, we have this problem with bias. We're extraordinarily, if I can use the word, manipulatable as a species, as we found from the impacts of social media, for example, but also even from basic things like the appearance of Google being neutral, when of course it's not. There's a long list of factors that are influencing the results. There's that apparent neutrality that seems to be the problem. But do you see, and this is something actually that I wanted to raise for the whole group, so I'd like to ask this question of you and then bring it back to the whole group. This problem of bias, whether it's intended or unintended, is there any way that you can see, Forrest, to stop that happening? Or is it something that we just have to be careful about?
I think a little bit of both. I guess what I wanted to say was I think that it's something that we need to attack on multiple levels, right? So I think there's technical ways of addressing it, where I can start to analyze what's the provenance of a piece of information, or if something's been recommended to me, let me audit why that came up. So there's technical ways of doing it where I can try to do something algorithmic or something to help understand it. But I think there's also social aspects. There's policy aspects. Maybe there's standards, for lack of a better word. But we have to really come together and agree, and first off, understand what the risks and what the challenges are here. But then, these are social questions. So we really need some social discussion about how we want to address these things and what we're all comfortable with together. And that goes far beyond what the technology can do for us. So I think education is part of it, but also the discussion and communication around it.
Thank you. Now, in a moment, I want to bring that question to Tom and Yolanda. But before I do, I'd like to ask just one further follow-up question from your presentation, Forrest. You were talking about the extraordinary scales, I would say, at which people are producing software. They're developing tools these days. How do you think we're doing in terms of the necessary collaboration tools to allow people to work together on these vast projects? Do you think there's room for improvement there? Do you think we're doing pretty well? Where are we at with that?
I think always room for improvement, but I think we're doing better in some ways than we give ourselves credit for. It's been a pleasure in a way to see what teams have been able to do while they've been remote during the course of the pandemic. And you have to look at something of Google, for example. I mean, working at that scale, these are teams that are distributed all around the world that can put their things together fairly seamlessly. So I think we've gotten over some of the major hurdles. We're doing better than some of us ever thought we would do. I can at least say that. But there's still a ways to go for sure.
Thank you. Yeah, I suppose it's iterative development, isn't it? Okay, so the time has gone so far. These discussions have been so fascinating. I'd like to bring just this question of bias to Yolanda and Tom, if you have anything to say about that. And then we've had several questions have come up from our attendees that I'd like to pick a couple of those and share them with you. Just anybody who wants to chime in, you can. But first of all, Yolanda, what are your thoughts on this question of bias, both intentional and unintended?
I think it's a really important topic in terms of privacy, in terms of the rights that every person has to understand why they might be discriminated against, and of course our responsibility to develop and, more importantly, deploy any kind of algorithm or computing capability, particularly AI, to make decisions or to support decisions. So we have a lot of work to do. AI systems have been deployed for decades. So since the 80s, banks have been making decisions on loans based on AI system recommendations. But the AI system does not make the ultimate decision. It's a human that makes them. I think, if we look at some of the AI deployments today, they're not... they don't appear to be going through quality control, which any other product would go through, or engineering safety provisions, which many products would have to go through. So there's a lot of aspects that I think we need to work on surrounding the technology, the social aspects that Forrest was alluding to. So much work to do in this space, and it's incredibly important.
Thank you. Thank you. Tom, do you have any thoughts on the subject?
Yeah, just in general, of course, I'm not going to comment on the AI aspect, but in general, bias needs to go away when you're in a crisis. And we're in a crisis, right? In several different aspects of computing. And also AI is resting on top of a computing model now that's not going to be sustainable. So there is truly a crisis, and bias is just a product of the human creators of these systems. And so I think that the urgency of the moment, hopefully, will at least give us a period where bias is less of an issue, or we're doomed, quite honestly.
Well, that connects really, thank you, Tom. That connects really nicely to my next question, actually. And this is open to whoever would like to contribute a response. Somebody mentioned, actually, let me get the name. It's just displayed here as CFB. Asked, what about the dangers of reliance on AI without a good amount of skepticism, since humans are providing the data and initial structure for thinking? And this opens up to me really nicely this idea of, is there a danger of overdependence on our technology, because we're increasingly in this socio-technical landscape. I can't remember the last time, for example, I bought a printed map. And so if there's an EMP strike in my town, I will have no idea where I'm going. Is there anything we can or should be doing to prevent over-reliance on our technology?
That ship has sailed long ago.
It's a good answer. Maybe
I want to say that it's a great question. I often wonder, are we better off having over-reliance on other humans? So I can't even count the number of times that before all of this technology was available to us, I would ask a human for directions and I would be sent in the wrong ways. So sometimes, I feel that we hold AI systems to a double standard. So judges make their worst decisions when they're hungry, right before they take a lunch break, right? So what tells us that humans are objective or can really make good decisions? So, but I'm going to go back to something that you said at the beginning, which is that my hope is that AI systems will make us better humans, that they'll help us notice our biases, that they'll help us notice when we're not being fair, that they'll help us get places better and faster, that that they will really improve how we are as humans. Because I think that we are very imperfect and we expect AI systems to be perfect. And the jury is out on that one.
Thank you. And I'm conscious the clock is ticking, but very briefly, a question I've been meaning to ask from the start. Just to note it, Michael H. posted in the comments here, will AI lead to George Orwell's 1984 future? I hope not. I'm going to answer that one myself. Hope for the best, plan for the worst, I suppose. But my question very briefly is this. It seems to me that computing power overtook human brains for repetitive and big data tasks a long time ago, but I have the impression we still have the edge when it comes to nuanced creative decisions, that particularly those that depend upon morals and ethics. What kind of developments, or let me phrase a slightly different question than the one I had planned. Is there anything that you think about human thinking is likely to stay superior to computed thinking? I'm being lazy with language there, but I hope you get my gist.
Let me just jump in, and that's easy. Energy efficiency. We're phenomenally more energy efficient than any machine thinking that we've ever invented.
I will say that I work a lot in AI for science, for scientific discoveries. And what I see is that 90% of the time that scientists spend at work in the office is tasks that could be automated, that could be better done through automation or through AI systems that apply some intelligence to doing some of those tasks. And the 10% that they spend actually thinking and being creative and approaching new problems and formulating new questions and really discovering things. I wish that was their 100% of their time. So maybe. I'm hoping that humans will just spend more time doing things that at least that we enjoy, that we, that's why we got into doing research and doing science or doing engineering. So that's my hope.
Want to do. Well, thank you. Well, I apologize cutting in there a little bit. I'm conscious that we have less than 1 minute for me to thank Forrest, Tom, and Yolanda for your fantastic presentations and insights. Here's to an optimistic, realist future. And thank you so much, everybody, for attending, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for all the great questions, Maxim.
Thank you.
Well, that concludes another incredible EVO virtual event filled with inspirational speakers. We'd like to thank you all for attending and to thank our panelists and keynoters. We'd also like to thank the folks at Mercer for sponsoring the event, the IEEE Computer Society, and all of our IEEE partners who helped us promote this event. We do hope you will join us for our next event, EVO 2.0, coming up on November 3rd with another fantastic lineup of speakers and panels featuring a fireside chat with myself and Nicole Bradford, CEO and founder of the Willow Group and executive director of the Transformative Technology Lab conference, and also TransTech 200 list. Should be a great time. Sign up for EVO 2.0 live now at evoconference.org, and be sure to follow along with IEEE-USA on all of our social media channels, be it Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, LinkedIn, wherever. We'll be there for you, and we'll be sharing information about EVO, and hopefully you'll share it with all your friends as well. Also, if you like what you see, please look into becoming an IEEE member and discover all the opportunities membership brings. Head on over to IEEE-USA.org/. Finally, I would like to spotlight the people who helped bring this conference to you. The IEEE USA communication staff, including Jonathan Cho, Corey Ruth, Greg Hill, Marnie James, and Georgia Steluto, as well as our volunteers on the IEEE USA Communications Committee, led by Chair Rob Weiss and Communications VP Brendan Godfrey. Until next time, I'm John Uglenski. We'll see you in November. Bye now.